Welcome to a new episode of Eindbazen. In this episode, we interview no one less than Bruce Parry. Eindbazen is Dutch slang for an individual who is a true boss in something that he does. And so we try to interview the most brightest and the most beautiful minds walking around on this planet. And well, Bruce is a true boss if it goes to visiting tribes all over the world. You might remember him from the television series on the BBC by the name of Tribe, where he would visit more than 15 tribes all over the world. He would live with indigenous communities. He would go to the forest. He would go to the Kalahari Desert. He would go to the jungle of the Amazon. He's done it all. He participated in ancient rituals, shamanic experiences, and mystical experiences. And he talks about it in our show here in this podcast. It was a total blast for us. I really loved it. I loved the way how humble he talks about the indigenous cultures, how they changed him, how they changed his vision on the world. And it was a true honor to have him here. A total badass, and I hope to have him back on the show in the future because we had so much to talk about. And I really this is a favorite of a personal favorite of mine. So I hope you guys enjoy this as well. If you would like to support our show, go to nutrifit.nl. Nutrifit.nl is the sponsor of our show. It is the food and supplement company of me and Michel. And there you can find all kinds of nootropic supplements like Onnit, Bulletproof, and Natural Stacks. Go there with the discount code Eindbazen and you will get yourself a 5% discount code. And that way you will support our podcast. Enjoy this podcast with Bruce Parry.
Look at the table today. We have...
It's going to be interesting because everybody knows you. Like a lot of people know you, but they don't know it. But they've seen you on television, right?
Here in the Netherlands?
Yeah.
Definitely, yeah. A lot of my friends, and maybe it's because I have a lot of friends that are interested in this topic, but most people who I actually, even my father-in-law, it's like, do you know this guy from the BBC? He went to all these tribes and been on television, did all this crazy stuff. And he's like, yeah, I remember him. So there's always,
nice.
They understand that.
Yep.
And anyway, today in the studio we got Bruce Parry, and Bruce Parry, you've been a frontier if it goes to, visiting tribes and actually participating in their rituals, ceremonies, whether it had something to do with drugs or hitting people with sticks. So a lot of weird shit going on there, but I'm really fascinated by the work that you have done, and you've done this for a while. And you're an interesting character as well. You're a former Marine. You're trying to start your own tribe at the moment, which is something interesting as well. And you just finished a new documentary called Tawai. Not on Netflix yet, but we're working on that, I hope. But I've seen the documentary last night. It had the premiere at Wicked Grounds in the Netherlands. And the reason why I was there was because I think a year ago I saw the first trailer. And what the trailer described was that you had a particular feeling with this one tribe in Borneo, which connected to me because I've been to Borneo 15 years ago. I went to the headhunters trails of the Iban. Mm. And at the time, I wasn't into it. I just went there as a tourist, and I saw the skulls hanging on the long houses, and it was funny and it was weird to be there. But I didn't really look into the tribal culture yet. But when you described your feeling that you experienced in the forest, the connection with the forest, with the plants, with nature, with the people. I felt like I know this feeling because I've experienced it myself in my time with indigenous tribes, and that was a reason for me to reach out. And 1 year later, I saw you were going into in the Dutch premiere at the Wicked Grounds, which is our favorite venue because we hosted actually our first podcast event there.
Really?
Yeah, nice. And I spoke on the first Wicked Thoughts event. So,
Really?
Yeah.
Great.
About my
They're
time.
great people.
They're
it's
cool.
really
So
nice
big
setup,
heads up
yeah.
for Tom and Jerry. Tom and Gerwin. But so I'm really happy that you're here, and I don't even know where to start. So you just blast them with your first question.
Well, where to start? Well, the most interesting thing about me in this prep was that it was great for me to actually talk to someone that from firsthand experienced some of the stuff I love reading about. I'm all about evolutionary psychology and where we came from as humans and the way we were actually biologically meant to be versus what we're doing nowadays. And there's a difference there, and that disconnect causes all kinds of ruckus. So maybe that's a good point to start.
Great.
Yeah. I am very curious because you obviously seen all these different places. You're also from modern society, but you also saw modern society all over the world. In your humble opinion, what's the biggest thing that we have forgotten that all these indigenous people are still doing that would largely improve our quality of life? Because I think they still have a few nuggets that we just forgot about.
Well, we could spend the next 2 hours
Let's
just
go for that,
answering
then.
that one question. Hi, by the way. Hi, guys. I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for having me. This is a fascinating area. There's no one thing that instantly comes to mind because there are so many that I think that would be really exciting to talk about. But the danger here in answering that question directly is, of course, that all of you said the indigenous groups, and of course there are so many, and they all have very different ways of being, and they're all very sort of unique in their own right. And so it's very hard to draw a generalization about all of the groups because they're all in different stages of shifting into the sort of world that we're comparing them to, you know. So that's hard. But by and large, I think they're more connected. I mean, if you wanted a simple answer off the top of my head, that word, they're connected to each other, to themselves, to nature. They have a deeper sense of feeling and connection than we do, a different sense of unity and being part of something greater than themselves than we do. I think that we're very much on a conveyor belt of individualism, and that's causing, you said yourself, so many of the complications in our society, whether it's mental health or addictions or other forms of physical health issues. A lot of these things can be put down to separation and our disconnection from each other in society and from nature. So I think the connection would be, in a simple one-word answer, the greatest thing. But there are many other things as well I'd love to talk about.
Yeah, I get it. But let's look at that connection bit first, because if you look at what's going on, the way they connect versus the way we sort of disconnect. What makes us disconnect more in modern society nowadays? What is the cause of that? Why aren't we connecting anymore?
Well, actually, there are a number of answers to that. One of the things that we look at in the film is the way that we're actually perceiving the world. I think there's some interesting studies being done now about perception, and the perception being the ground basis of how we interact and how we are. And one of the things we look at in the film is our brains, actually, and the hemispheres. And we go and meet this very interesting guy, Dr. Ian McGilchrist, who talks about the bilateralization of the brain and the different ways that we perceive and interact and relate. And that's not an easy thing to go into in this podcast because that's quite a specific area. But it does have something to do with the way in which we're perceiving also relates to the way in which we're bringing attention. And when, for example, we were hunting and gathering, you have a very different type of attention that's required that we don't use very often anymore. You have to be incredibly present in your body, in your senses, in order to be able to find the food, to be able to hunt, to be able to find where things are naturally growing, which you don't need to do in today's life. You don't need to bring that type of attention. And anyone who's done a Vipassana or a meditation retreat knows that one of the things that people who go into doing deep meditation work, the difference you have at the beginning and at the end of that, one of the things people often talk about is I feel more connected. That's one of the things that people often come out and say, I feel more in my body, I feel more empathically connected to that which is around me. And so I think that one of the things is that we used to meditate on a daily basis and we don't anymore. So that's one very simple answer. there's a whole bunch of other reasons why I think that they're more connected and they're more able to be present, is because they grow up in community. They grow up where they have less, they're carrying less trauma. They probably have less problems in that they can disperse those early traumas when they are when there's more people around, and they don't. It's like the family unit is another thing that's causing a lot of issues in our society, I think, and they don't have that. They have a much more communal way of being. And like we could go on, but
yeah. Well, let's look at that first thing just a little, because what you said is like it's sort of a perception thing. Although to me, the way you describe it sounds more like an attention thing, because you need to pay attention to what's happening right now.
Word. Yeah,
probably.
That, yeah.
But there's also a connection to the perception thing, and that might tap into that community thing. If you look at the stories they tell, and we look at the classical hero myths of our society, it's usually one guy that's going to kick some ass. Is it the same over there, or have they shared their stories? And is there something like a pattern there, or is it like groups of people that venture out and go on adventures?
Interesting. Well, one of the other things we'd sort of discuss in the film a little bit is that, and this comes back to my introduction, is that there are huge differences between the indigenous groups. And for most of the time that I was traveling the world making my TV documentaries, I would have said that we all pretty much fell into that same hero journey type narrative, and there is this sort of this aspect that most of the tribal groups have. And actually, I would have probably said that deep down, despite there's all these connections and these wonderful things that these groups have, they are actually incredibly similar to us in many ways. Their societies have many of the similar attributes to our society. So the differences on the sort of macro level aren't so much. But then I came across the last group that I lived with, the Penan people in Borneo, who would feature in this film Tawai. And with them, I noticed something completely different. It was like almost like every other tribe that I've lived with and every other society that I've ever been with are in one pot, and then this group in a completely different pot. And that took me a long time to have the courage to express, because it felt quite weird, and it felt like overly romantic, and it felt I didn't feel like I had the credibility to say things like that, but that was the feeling that I had. And then since then I've done research and I've met anthropologists and realized that no, there was actually something incredibly different about that group. And there are a few other groups who are like them, and they all relate to the time before the Neolithic Revolution. They all relate to the time before the domestication of plants and animals for food. And there's only a few left. But what you find with those groups is that their sense of narrative would not have the hero's journey. It would definitely not.
Interesting.
Because their narrative is about egalitarianism. Their narrative is about no competition. Their narrative is about no hierarchy. And they all buy into that narrative. Each and every person in that group knows that the group is better off if we're all together. And that narrative somehow got severed. And all of the other groups, they all are perfectly happy with hierarchy, with leadership, with shamans, with chiefs. And this group would never allow a shaman or a chief to step up. This is a time before that. And the weird thing is that when you really scratch away, you realize that was probably 95% of our time as humans on the planet.
Interesting.
That's fascinating.
Is it always agriculture that enforces this hierarchy? So are there hierarchical tribes that do hunter-gatherer?
So yes, there are. But and the story obviously is relatively complex. But what is now kind of considered to be the case, and not in every circle. I mean, this is not fully accepted in every anthropological institute in every university around the world. This is I think there are very prominent anthropologists who will be saying what I'm saying now, and I think that's growing. But it's not fully accepted, so I have to be careful in my language because I'm not an academic.
Well, I'm sorry.
No, please.
Well, it's a very I think the term is laden it has a lot of weight to it lately because the whole discussion nowadays is like, are hierarchies social constructs or are they nature's way of organizing things as efficiently as possible? And especially in politics, there's a lot of left people saying, no, these are social contracts and you sort of have privilege because of these things, and that's why you can't say certain things. So that's why it's interesting to me to see if this is biology's way of fixing things.
Well, when I've asked the anthropologists who specialize in this, I remember saying, and it's actually also in the film, talking to this wonderful guy, Jerome Lewis, and his wife, Ingrid, so is this innate? And he's like, no, it takes a great deal of work on many levels, social, political, ritual. It has to be worked at. And so that's what you see. You see they have these tools in place that maintain this. But the biggest tool I think they have is narrative. They are all buying into the idea that we're all better off as equals. And that is the thing that somehow has lasted since we first became human all the way up to until agriculture kicked in. And to go back to your question about agriculture, it's like, it's not necessarily agriculture per se, it's a whole, like with everything, it's a whole bunch of stuff. But I think that what they generally now believe is the way that this sort of egalitarian, equal way of living shifted and we turned more to hierarchy was probably when we left the tropics, where it's much easier to have that way of being when you're living in an environment where there's abundant resources and there's equal access to those resources. You look at the difference between the chimpanzees and the bonobos. One of the big differences between those two groups is the bonobos, who are much more egalitarian in the way that they're living. They have lots of traits that are very similar to the egalitarian human tribes that we see, and the strong female presence and all that sort of stuff. One of the things that you see the difference between their environments is that the bonobos they both have abundant resources, but the bonobos' resources are much more spread out. Yeah. So it's much harder for them to come together and gang up and protect and hold and ownership.
Right, like a water pool. Yeah. If there's only one water pool, Absolutely. Then there's going to be conflict.
Pretty much that. Yeah. Even though there's enough, they're not choosing to share.
Yeah.
Whereas with the bonobos, it's much more spread out. And so one of the theories that people think about how this sort of egalitarian way might have shifted is we left the tropics, and then you go into areas where there's drought, periods of drought or periods of cold, and so you have to store to get through that. And then who is it that gets to share and give out the stores? And so that may well have been the thing that led to power and hierarchy coming in and then taking over, and then all the things that go with it.
Makes perfect sense. Yes.
And of course, not only that, then when you have those periods of drought and whatever, there is a possibility for famine. There is a possibility for real difficulties. And then you've got then that growth of complexity and all the stuff that the children have to deal with that then is in
probably aggression, right? If the resources get more scarce, then
the Maslow's hierarchy of needs is still present for all of us wherever we are. Yeah. People can still go through that, that turning to immoral behavior if things are really bad. And I think that's the same for all these people. They're not different to us. They just they had a different environment and they had a different set of values.
Strategies, basically, to cope.
Basically. You could say that you're literally a product of your own environment.
I think very much so. I mean, this again is this is the ongoing debate, nature, nurture, sort of genetics versus the environment. Yeah. But my humble opinion is that, yes, genes clearly play an important role, but a vital role, but actually the environment is always going to be the bigger influencer in the whole thing.
Yeah, what epigenetics kind of suggests as well, that you get certain traits based on what your ancestors had to endure. Yeah, so if they had to endure a lot of cold, that would probably throw on a few switches.
But the most interesting thing for me on this line, if I may, of course. Is how did they get that story? If we stayed for 180,000 years as egalitarians and everyone's buying into this story, this narrative of we're better off as equals, how did we get it? That's the interesting thing, because of course we came from primates, if we believe that we came from primates, and all the other primates are alpha male, harem-based, very strong hierarchical power man structures. But if we were egalitarian, how did we get to that? And what was the thing that happened? And I was very lucky. It's not in the film that we just made, but I did go with these wonderful anthropologists, Jerome and Ingrid Lewis, to a tribe that they've been living with for 20, 30 years in Africa. And when I went to visit those people, I had an insight into where that story, where that narrative might have come about. And they still have a song and a dance and a ritual that they say relates to that very moment of when we became human. And what is played out in that song and dance and ritual is the women coming together and saying no to the alpha male and inviting the other men in, provided that they come without competition and aggression in their hearts.
That sort of kind of answers a question that I had when we were talking about chimps versus bonobos, because you were talking about tools of keeping the community egalitarian. And I was wondering, how does this do they use the same tools as bonobos do, for example? Because bonobos are kind of infamous for something that they do. They have a lot of sex to regulate the stress in the community. Is that something you see in these?
Well, I tell you that there's a number of tools. But so let's say, for example, I was with this group in Africa, and the African group they're not in this film that I've just made. We took them out, sadly, but there it was much more evident this work that's going on a daily basis to maintain the equality. And so, for example, I was with the guys one time. We were charging around the tribe up and down the village, like in a rugby scrum, with our arms over each other and huffing and puffing and being all macho and all the rest of it, but in a very sweet way. It was so interesting being with them. And at the end of that, one of them pointed out another guy at the other end of the village. He said, "You see that guy over there? He's the best hunter here. We all know it. We hunt elephants. He's the guy that has the wooden stake, and he runs out first and stuffs it into the belly of the elephant, and then we come out afterwards. But he's the madman. He's the guy that does it." But a couple of years ago, he started showing off that he was the best hunter. So we just refused to go hunting with him. And then the women refused to cook his food, because we all know that isn't what we want around here. So even on the level of showing off, they are working on a daily basis to maintain that not happening.
I've heard the same similar story about an African tribe who, when they go hunting in groups, and they mix up all the arrows in the basket, I think. And so if an animal gets shot, we never knew who actually shot the animal.
Nice.
So
I think I heard something similar, that you weren't allowed to drag your catch into the village. You leave it at the outskirts, and then the women go find it, and it's kind of obscure who brought the kill in. So there won't be any of this, because you can't help that if we're in a group of 10 guys and we see you constantly bringing home the kills, and we all notice this, it kind of, like you said, they sort of keep the balance. They know he's the best guy.
And I think many tribes have different methods for that. There's so many different things. There's some tribes where you're not allowed to eat the food that you catch. So there's all sorts of different tools and methods. And what I just noticed with these egalitarian groups is it's still working. It's still working so much that they still don't have chiefs, shamans, or any form of hierarchy. And that's and even competition. This was the hardest thing, because what you see when you watch the film is I talk about this tribe that I went to visit, the Penan. They were the last group I visited, and there was something about them that was completely different to any other group, but I couldn't figure out what it was. It was just for me, who's lived with tribes all over the world. I came across this group. And by the way, all of those tribes, of course, wonderful. Of course, so many lessons learned. Of course, so much wisdom, so much connection. I'm not in any way diminishing or dismissing the great privilege of having met these other extraordinary groups. But there was something unique. Of course, they're all unique in the way. But there was something very different, let's say, about this group that really stood apart. And it took me a long time to figure out what it was. But one of those things was that I noted there is just no competition. And you're like, that's an almost invisible thing. It's very, very hard to discern that. But that's what, over time now, I've come to realize probably what was at the heart of that experience of being with them that was so different. And when I was with that group in Africa, I had the same thing. They're both egalitarian, what they call immediate return nomadic hunter-gatherer groups, the last ones who are like that in the world. And again, charging around with these guys in Africa, and someone threw a big stick out, a long stick, and that sort of landed in the middle of the boys. And so half of us grabbed one side, with the stick long between us, and half grabbed the other side. And I was like, cool, well, we're just going to have a tug of war. That's what guys would do. That's what we would all do. Yeah. Two groups split between a clear line that splits us, and we all grab it, look each other in the eyes. And like, that's what's going to happen. But what was so strange was like, we pushed and pulled and graphed and flexed our muscles and like, and cheered and shouted. But at no time did it become us versus them. And it was just the subtle things like that. It was like, it just sends a shiver down my spine now to be, that was when this subtle feeling that I had all the time in the group rose to a moment where I was like, that's what it is. That's what it is. We're not trying to outdo each other. It's we all understand at the base level of who we are that this is just the better way to be. And it's not to say that they're not capable of competition. Of course they are. They have it inside us. The same as like that guy who wanted to show off to be the better hunter. But they have worked at it so hard within the narrative of their being that they just keep it out of the way. That was so extraordinary to me.
What I noticed in the documentary when you were talking about there's no hierarchy, then I was thinking about my experiences where there is hierarchy. There are tribes leaders. There are
the
shamans.
Amazonian experiences, yeah.
Yeah. But, you know, there's hierarchy and everybody, it seems to be a thing in their culture because for them, the shamans are considered as second gods because the medicine of ayahuasca has been planted there to be connected with the gods, right? So there's always this vision of the shaman. The shaman is everything there. And they every time when we do the circle where everybody can talk their thoughts and what's on their mind, they always thank the shaman and the spiritual leader. And there's a big holding on to it. But there's a hierarchy. But on the other hand, there's not really a hierarchy because, for example, when I was there, they were choosing a new political leader. And they didn't choose it themselves. There was actually, just before a ceremony, 3 guys did a small introduction talk. I couldn't make any sense of it. But I heard later on, they were kind of telling their vision of how to become a leader in something. And then the shaman just told, like, okay, we're going to drink the medicine. Tomorrow we will know the answer. That's their way of decision making for political leaders. Would be interesting for our
but how do you get on that list of 3 people? That would be the real question.
That was an interesting thing because one of them was the nephew of the tribe's leader, which in Donald Trump's eyes would probably be the first candidate, you know, and that's what we see. I mean, even placing his own daughter and his own family in important seats. And so that's when I thought, like, okay, well, he's family, and you're not. Yeah, there is choice here.
It's fascinating how societies across the world, in let's say the last 10,000 years, have dealt with this situation of getting through difficult times and being like the message I gave to your king. It's like, you know, there were probably times in the early stages when we moved into this form of hierarchy and leadership that they still had the narrative of like equality, but actually there was a very difficult situation and it maybe needed someone to step up and go, come on, let's get through. And then they step down again and then we go back to the equality. And I think that might have been the initial stage. But the trouble is, in my experience, is that even though, not experiences, sort of my ponderings on this, because I've also seen many, many different methods of leadership where you have amazing benign dictatorships, amazing leaders who really do genuinely care for the well-being of their people and all the rest of it. But there is something else that's happening also, especially as the group gets bigger. Because when it's small, there's a lot of checks and balances within it that you can you have to deal with your situation because you're living amongst all the other people. But when you start building the castles and the whole thing goes down a slightly different route where there's more people and there's more separation, then the power corrupts. And we've always known that it's a creeping thing and it just tends to always be like that. And so even we see in the recent history, even with the most well-meaning revolutions, they always end up just replacing like with like. Yeah. And so ultimately what I think that these people are holding on to is like, yes, of course this guy is an amazing guy and maybe we could listen to him. But if we let him just be the guy for his life, then that is only going to go one direction.
I think they found the antidote in the fact that, it's not what you preach, it's what you tolerate, and they just don't tolerate it. So any outburst of, for example, ego or trying to climb that hierarchy is immediately put down. And I think that's why we have guys in power and that remain in power, because we, as a community, maybe because we're too big, maybe because we don't know how, don't go like, nope, we're not going to help you anymore.
We've also bought into the narrative that that's the way it's always been.
Yeah.
We've forgotten that little thing. And so we're like, well, actually, a rising tide raises all ships. It's ever been thus. We've always been like this. We've always been patriarchal. We've always been aggressive. We've always been whatever. And so we just accept it, whereas they won't accept it. And that's the difference.
Kind of wondering, though, because I think you're right that the typical hierarchical leadership arises when trouble occurs. So now there's a situation. Did you talk about them, or did you see stuff that kind of suggests how they tackle problems where we would use leadership? For example, hunting an elephant would be very useful if there's one guy like, charge now, except, or leave it to the group and they're like, should we go now? I don't know. Well, we need a guy that goes ahead of the guys. Absolutely. And you'll probably find that guy who they all acknowledged was the better hunter may well have taken roles at certain times where he's like, let's go this way now because he probably did know more. There's nothing wrong with being the better hunter. It's just the only thing they didn't want was him thinking that he was more than. So they maybe use hierarchies, but they're competence hierarchies. It's not even hierarchy. I would just say that they use wisdom when it arises. Everyone, the small child, as soon as you can walk in that society, you're an equally valid member of valid member of society. You don't even have to listen to your own parents. You can do whatever you. That's a big thing to take on board. Let's not go down that rabbit hole.
But also your thing about, I'm sorry to interrupt, but also your thing about he's the shaman or he's the doctor. What I noticed is that people are I also heard stories like he's the cook of the school, and they were telling it in a way like that's an important job. I was like, but I was almost like he's just a cook, Sure. But it's But
that's the other thing. It's like everyone, they all value each other equally. That's the thing. It's not that everyone's the same. Of course not. Everyone knows that there's different skill sets and different abilities, but no one's seen as more than. And that is, so differences, because this is one of the things we get confused in our societies. We think that equality is the same as sameness. But actually, we're not trying to say that everyone needs to be the same. That's madness. That's what Jordan's talking about the whole time. It's like that only leads to complications because we're clearly not the same. But if you take away the desire or the drive to be the same and just replace it with a drive to be equal and be valued equally, then it's a very different thing. And so, yes, let's celebrate differences. They are differences, and they're happy to accept those differences and even differences in skill sets, but doesn't mean you're more than. That's why they didn't want to go hunting with him, not because he's not the better hunter, but because he started showing off that he was better than. That was the thing that got them. And so, of course, there can be roles and moments when people step up and say, follow me. But no one has to. No one has to. It's like, whatever. Because now this tribe, for example, I was with in Africa, there's a lot more interaction with the outside world now. And some of the Bantu tribes who live next to them who, of course, have had a long legacy of hierarchy and leadership and ownership. And they're giving these egalitarian groups quite a hard time for, like, taking shit off their women and all this sort of stuff. So there's a little bit of change happening within the egalitarian groups. And Jerome was telling me this wonderful story where he used to go and visit this tribe. And one particular character in the tribe would, like, start telling him that he was the chief. And it's like, I'm the chief. And then I remember this... and everyone just like sort of raising their eyes and looking to the sky and stuff. And this little kid walking past him, he goes, no, you're not the chief, you're a fucking idiot or something.
That's good.
And so that's it. No one's actually limited or coerced in any way, but it's just no one's having to buy into it. So that guy can say he's the chief till he's blue in the face, but no one's following him.
Yeah, I get it. Okay, can we talk a little bit about the neighboring tribes? Because I was wondering about that. Did these guys were they ever exposed to warfare? So did they have to fight other tribes?
Well, this is the other thing. We're talking now about a time and a group of people that represent a long time ago. So this particular group that we're now sort of centering on, who are very different to the other indigenous groups that I met. Their time, let's say, was like 10,000 years ago. Was when that was when everyone was like that. And I remember saying the other thing to Jerome when I was with him. It's like, okay, Jerome, so you see this group of people here who you're telling me are equal and there's all these wonderful value systems, but surely they must be in competition with the group across the road, across the river, across, they might not be competition here because they all have this wonderful way of being with each other where they got the checks and balances, and they're all in fear of being outcast is another way that they maintain balances, by the fear of being ostracized from the group. So they have these very clear tools and methods for maintaining balance, but they must be in competition with the next group. And he goes, Bruce, you don't get it, do you? And I'm like, okay, well, what is it now that I don't get? And he's like, Bruce, this what you see now, don't forget these are nomadic hunter-gatherers. So like what you see now is this like 10 families. Well, if you come back in 6 months, that 2 or 3 of those families will have gone somewhere else, and another 2 will have come in, and this whole thing won't be here anyway, it'll be somewhere else. You forget that this is an ever-changing, amorphous, overlapping family group that goes out for hundreds of thousands of people throughout the whole forest, and at one time spread out through the whole tropical belt of the whole world. What we think of as tribe is these differences between groups, but actually it's not tribal. It's actually just a way of being that used to be throughout the whole tropics for all humans.
Yeah.
When you get your head into that space, you're like, well, no, they're not at war with the other because there's no group that have a special identity that's different to the group across the way. That's madness.
I don't think Hollywood did me a favor in that regard with movies like Apocalypto, where I go like, yeah, that's how it must have been. You have these little cabins in the wood, and
but of course, like, that's why so much of what we're at, where we're at, and also so many of our experiences are based on things like, you know, the narratives that we're fed today. Let's not forget that actually this type of being never even made it to the Americas. Yeah. So every group that we think, in Amazon, it's got the oldest groups, like no one even got to the Amazon until, 10,000 years ago. I mean, this was already beginning to change. Anyone who got to the Americas had to have left the tropics, had to go through these shifts, had to go into the Arctic, had to go through the Bering Straits, whatever it is. All of this will have probably shifted long before the Amazon was even occupied. Yeah. So we're talking about, yes, it's 95% of our time on the planet, but most groups are not holding this. This is like only a few who give us the indication of what it was like. And so, so like all of that stuff from the Incas and the Aztecs, and of course, it's like mad, like civilizations and fighting and all the rest of it. But it never, this thing that I'm talking about never even made it there.
Fascinating. Yeah. It's such a different way of thinking. I noticed that you have all these biases. And I'm trying to imagine if we would project these values on an average Dutch company and how terribly wrong that will go, because everybody's just so used to doing what we're doing. Looking at the leader, he has a vision. We just, we try to climb the hierarchy a little. It helps us with sexual selection. It's this whole thing. And they step out of that game completely. So it is possible. And that's very interesting. It must be very liberating as well.
I think it is liberating. And it's a weird one, this whole liberating thing, because in some ways they all have this universal mindset. So they all see themselves as part of the group. So in that sense, there's a limiter on it because your behavior is limited. But in this other sense, you can be whoever you want to be. And so there's this beautiful mix of being free and also being sort of like part of the bigger, it's beyond yourself.
But isn't that what fails in this society, is that people don't feel part of anything? And another thing, I think another ingredient for this thing is transparency. You were talking about it in the documentary as well, where you see a shot of all the families in the forest and you see everything of everyone. And I remember that it's similar, like arguments, because they have arguments too. They have boyfriend-girlfriend fights also. And it's a public thing. There's no secret. Yeah. There are no secrets for each other. So you can't hide your food stash or whatsoever. And I noticed it in the small things where I was smoking my cheroot, like kind of on my own, like having it for myself. And then everybody was like, why are you smoking it alone? I felt kind of guilty of my own habit of just having it for myself.
That's just bad smoking etiquette, man. It's like puff, puff, pass. You should notice.
Yeah. But it's really in their culture of that sharing. Yeah, the sharing and having this transparency about everything. Now, imagine a culture or a company where everything is transparent, because in most companies, people are ashamed of who they are, where they come from, what they did, blah, blah, blah. But if that all is transparent, well, what do you have to be ashamed for? Nothing.
It's so funny, isn't it? It's like so many of the things that we highlight as like the greatest desires and goals of society is like, it's like so more money, more fame, more those things. I'm sure that in your podcast you've talked about the problems with that. But like one of the other ones that's more subtle is things like freedom, free time, free space.
Yeah.
Those things, it's like, well, clearly you're not going to contest them as well, Bruce. But actually, no, even that within the group, I would say that the happier groups that I've met are the ones who have least free space, freedom in that sense. In the ones who, freedom's the wrong word, but like the closer the groups are and the less borders and barriers and walls between them, the more that they are transparent and their lives are completely intermingled with everyone around them. Generally, the more calm and content are the people that I've met. And that's such a weird thing, because like so many of us was like, no, I would never be able to do that. It's like, there's no way I could give up my free space to be in that. But in some way, that's my learning, is that actually some of those things that we hold on to so dear, like the freedoms of space and time.
I think that's because of a lack of hierarchy. Because for example, the fighting got me thinking, like, if there's no walls and borders, there's no way. If we have an argument, there's no way to do this in private.
Yeah.
And why do we want to do it in private? Because we think it's embarrassing to have a fight or conflict that should be between the two of us. Why? Because if we look disharmonious, we look incompetent. And if we look incompetent, we drop on the ladder. If people see that, they're going to think, oh, these guys are idiots. So the chances of us, getting either more customers or getting the benefits for the system decrease the more we drop down on that ladder. And if there's no ladder, and you're not worried about where you are on that ladder, well, life just became a lot more simple.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder if there was more advocacy, more transparency. Like we're looking at all the things that are happening in Facebook at the moment, with all of these like AstroTurf campaigns and all the Russian influencers and all that sort of stuff. But if everyone had an authorized account, which was clearly them, and of course, no one wants that, because we love our anonymity. We love our ability to remain secret. But I wonder how society would shift if actually we had to stand up. And when we vote, it's like you have to put it on the thing and everyone sees what it is. It's like we value so much the freedom to have invisible voting. And in some places, obviously, because of oppression and regimes and stuff, that no doubt serves a purpose. But in the wider society, if it was like really set out whereby we could do it, where there weren't those sort of pressures of terror, and we had the choice of either doing it in private or doing it in public, I think that would be interesting to really have to stand up to what it is you're doing.
But I think coming back to that thing about the political election with the use of ayahuasca, that I really noticed that people have their preferences of who they want to be elected, but if it's not if it doesn't become the person they had in mind, they still have a sense of peace with it, because the Yushibu, their spirit, their God, made the decision. Yeah. So it's probably the right decision.
Well, I think that will always depend on the outcome. It's like, so I spent some time with the Kogi people in Colombia, who are fascinating group of people. They're the civilization that live in the Santa Marta, the sort of Sierra Nevada to Santa Marta in Colombia. They have a very interesting politics and religion, let's say, that's working. And they have a very similar thing whereby they have 10% of the entire civilization, there's say 30,000 of them, are of this sort of spirit priest leader class. So one in every village, or two in every village. And they make these decisions through divination. So they have little stones that they put in bowls of water and they watch the bubbles, and that's how they make their decisions. So again, they say there's no ego, there's no me in this. This is just me channeling through a Luna, and then they all come together and make these decisions for what happens. Wow. And so in a sense, they have a very similar thing, which is whereby they're stepping away and allowing it to be channeled. But what's fascinating about that is, if that didn't work, if that was just actually an excuse for them putting themselves in there and they were doing it for their own gains, then that probably would have gone the way of many other civilizations and fallen apart. But what's fascinating about that group is that the population genuinely seem to be following these decisions because the decisions are working.
Yeah.
And they are still making. Now, whether or not it is directly channeled through a Luna, as they call it, and the Great Spirit, and and the universal consciousness, or whether it is just them deluding themselves, or whether it is just a very good way of making decisions where you don't have to take accountability, whatever it is, it seems that it's working.
Are they on entheogenics?
They're not, but they have a very deep meditative way of being.
All right, because I was wondering about that as well with the more egalitarian groups. Do they use entheogenics? Like drugs? Do they use drugs?
I think again, we're talking about what would have been a whole vast area, and no doubt they would have perhaps come across them. The ones that I've spent time with, the group in Africa, they did. The women on occasionally would use it because they would use a particular route. When the men went hunting elephant, they might go for 2 or 3 days. And so the women would often take this route that would give them of visions. And then they would all experience a shock in their spine and a shaking when the elephant was killed. And that's when they knew that they had to then prepare the fire and stuff and go out to meet the men. And
interesting.
So there are definitely experiences of those people using plants in order to give them greater connection. But I don't think in the same way that we think of the ayahuasca tribes and stuff on a ritual daily or regular basis.
The reason I ask is because in the 60s, obviously, we sort of had the same thing going for a while over here due to LSD. And there's something about ayahuasca, LSD, psilocybin that sort of seems to push back the ego and make you think more in non-dualistic ways.
I totally agree.
So I was wondering if there was a connection between their way of organizing and...
You know what? I mean, one of the things, again, we talk about in the film, when I look at the group that I visit, I'm like, why is it that they're so different? And so they're this sort of nomadic hunter-gatherers, and they're all sharing and stuff. And it kind of makes sense to share because you're on the move and you can't store things, you don't have fridges, and so it's easy. So there's a whole bunch of reasons logically why these people have this way of being that's much more free, easy, and open and equal. But one of the other things that I touched on earlier is that they're all meditating every day because hunting and gathering is a form of meditation. When you want to catch the monkey, you've got to be alert in the moment, present in your senses, in your body, fully focused yet fully aware in order to get your food. And that's a daily ritual. And so they're all exercising that part of themselves. And so I think that I know the questions about entheogens, but actually in its own right, there are a whole bunch of different tools that societies have had that bring about a similar state of awareness. And so I think that at one time we didn't need to because we were already balanced and empathically connected and feeling the world in that way. Yeah. But as we shifted from that, as we left that hunter-gatherer space, nomadic hunter-gatherer space, and started settling and moving to farming and all these other things, it may well have been that societies needed to find these tools more so that they could be reminded of that way of being that we always had. So I think that things like the ayahuasca and things like some of these medicines, things like the rise of the shaman who lived perhaps on the outskirts of the village and could have more wisdom because he wasn't getting caught up in the daily madness. Things like meditative practices and song and dance and drumming and all these sorts of things, they may well have taken more prominence as we moved away from that earlier way of being where it wasn't so necessary. There's one group that I go and visit in the film in the Amazon, and they're not egalitarian in the same way as the other tribes, but that's irrelevant. One thing is you see this group and they go out into the forest, and I remember hearing about them from this famous linguist called Daniel Everett who wrote this book, and in the book he described how this group had no past or future tense to their language. It doesn't mean they have no future or past, but they use it linguistically so minimally that they haven't bothered to create but somehow they don't have a tense that like defines the future and the past. So everything they say is about the here and now. And when you meet them, and when the way he describes them is that they're only really interested in things that are experienced around us now. So the conversation that we're having is fine, and we can talk about things that we've all experienced. But if you start telling me about someone that you've not even met and what his experience is like, that's just two levels of two levers of away from where anyone wants to go. You know, you're abstracting out of this experience too far, and they're not interested. Which is why they've never had a missionary ever convert them, because it's like, well, have you met this guy?
Yeah.
Has your mum met this guy?
Who's this Jesus fella?
Has your mum met him? What's it? They're just not interested. They're like, well, so that's interesting. But what's also interesting is in his book, he described how this group of people also had a direct connection with some voices in the forest that guided them. And I was like, wow, that's fascinating. And so, and sure enough, I go and meet them and I ask them about this, and they say that these voices talk to them in the heart. And that was like really powerful for me, because I just was curious as to how they received this information. So here, to make a long story short, they are, here is a group of people who the only group I know who don't need to use any drumming or dancing or plant medicines or anything, and they are living in this extraordinary world where when they go into the forest, especially when they're hunting, they are absolutely having what I think would be that experience that you're talking about, where they're connecting to something that's so powerful that it even communicates with them. And when you hear them talking about how this communication comes, it's like they're having a dialogue. It's like, yeah, he's telling me now that I have to go here, and like he says this, and he tells me not to take too much, and I have to go back now, and you shouldn't chop down the big trees. And it's this guidance, which is similar to, what you're writing about in your book. Yeah. It's like, that
connection.
What is
forest.
that? Yeah, what is that? And here's a group of people who've no need for entheogens. They're just having it because they're fully present.
Yeah. What I find interesting, that regardless of the tools they use, be it hunting, meditation, or entheogens, that you were talking about the voice from the forest, and we did podcasts with Wiggert when he came back from the Amazon, and he taught me about Yushibu, which was basically the same thing. Is that a common thing in hunter-gatherers, that there's this global bigger consciousness thing that we all tap into? Is there a pattern there?
I think absolutely. I think many of the groups that I'm talking about would be what you would call animistic. And so for them, the whole universe is alive, animated. And they will clearly all have different names for different entities. They will have different understandings of whether or not entities are malevolent or benign. And, it's not just a beautiful, glorious space. There are different forces out there, and that would be a common thing that I think most of them would say. But the human species had left Africa a long time ago, and we're spread out in many places, and clearly there were so many idiosyncrasies of each of these groups with their own different takes on it and their own different myths and narratives and stuff. That's why it was interesting going to the group in Africa with Jerome and Ingrid, because there I was tapping into what's probably the oldest lineage. I mean, if we came from that part of Africa, or maybe southern Africa where the San Bushmen and these people, but the San have been influenced a lot because they're very visible in the Kalahari, whereas here is a group of people who are still living in the Congo, and their rituals are very intact. Like that one I was telling you about, where they relate back to the story of the first moving away from hierarchy into equality. I mean, that there was an interesting one for me, because that's feels very much something that you could talk about is really ancient, before we've left and all of these changes.
How did this change your own spiritual belief system on life, death, afterlife? It can. I mean, of course, I did some research, and the thing you talked about animism. Yeah. You call yourself a rational animist. What exactly is apparently that's what your Wikipedia says. But I
seen a picture of my Wikipedia page? I mean, I don't think I was involved in any of those. I don't think I was involved.
You wouldn't have chosen that picture, is what you meant. No, I understand.
You can change it, right?
I don't know. No, well, yeah, probably.
I don't even know.
I think that's frowned upon if you change your own wiki page. But still, this contact with all these belief systems, it must have shaped your own in some form.
Yeah, well, in the film we go into this a little bit. It's like, I started out very much from the perspective of a Western school kid. It's like science answers everything, and I haven't had crazy experiences that have made me question that, and most of my friends haven't either, so we're just all in that camp. And then, of course, I go on this journey and I meet all these things. I meet all these people. I do these wonderful ceremonies, and I start having experiences that basically science wasn't answering so well, especially material science. And that I would come back from having ayahuasca in the forest and talk to my clever friends who I looked up to as intellects much greater than my own, and like people who I rated, and say, so what was this? And they were like, oh, Bruce, you idiot, you're just doing a drug. So you stick it in a box and label it just doing a drug, and then on you go with your journey because life's busy. But I remember there's a number of things that have really influenced me in my changes over time. And one of them was when I saw Jill Bolt Taylor, the lecturer of this brain scientist who had a stroke in the left hemisphere of her brain. And she describes this experience of expansion and oneness.
I saw that one. When she was in the show, she had a TED talk about that one, right?
Yeah. It's a beautiful TED talk. It's like 20 million people watched it or something. It's like very, very influential TED talk. And I was like, dropped my tea almost. It's like, shit, that's the experience that I had when I was doing those things. And here's someone with credibility. Here's a scientist who knows the brain talking about it. And she talks very much about the left and right hemisphere and things. And that's what got me onto researching and learning about that. That's why I met this guy, Ian McGilchrist, who's spent his life studying that. And that made sense to me. So suddenly I realized that there were these different ways of perceiving and being and experiencing. And so that shifted me, because I've never wanted to just land in the land of like believing anything. I've wanted to, I grew up very Christian. It was a very Christian family. And when I let go of that, I kind of made a vow to myself to never just blindly believe in anything again. I don't want to just let go. So I've wanted a rational explanation of everything as I went along. But I've had these experiences that have been very hard to explain. And the other big one was when I was with the Coggy, the group I was just telling you about, who are in Colombia. They have this really interesting thing about them too, whereby some of these spirit leaders that they have, these sort of priest leaders, are trained in a really curious way. They're trained, like taken almost from birth, and basically trained in complete darkness for like 9, 18 or 27 years. So many of them leave at like the age of 18, having not seen anything of the world. They've been kept in caves and houses, and like enough so that they don't go blind with the moonlight and stuff, but essentially
literal darkness.
Literal. And then these people, they're trained during that period of like sensory deprivation to basically feel the connection to nature and commune with nature and all the rest of it. Now, the scientists that you had on earlier would have said, well, they're just replacing the lack of stimulation with their own imagination. And so I couldn't tell you whether or not that's delusional or whether they're actually tapping into something real. But like, I'm not at the same time, if I want to make a documentary and study these things, these people have a place in the story. At least that. So I may be a rationalist, but I'm curious as to what they're going to say. Maybe we are just all deluded, and maybe there is no connection between our subjective experiences, or maybe there is. So anyway, so I went to meet these people, and I asked them, and they said that they would allow me to come film, and we were going to make a doc. And then at the end, I said, well, is there anything I can do to prepare? They said, yeah, give up sex, drugs, alcohol, and then maybe you can get yourself into the right mind state for us. And long story short, I kind of agreed. But as I was leaving Colombia, there's a couple of people with me, and they're like, Bruce, they're going to be watching you. They know that if you don't do this thing, they're going to know about it. And I remember thinking, no, that's nonsense. I mean, like maybe when I come back, they can read my body language and see that see whether I'm lying or not. But like they're not actually going to be literally connecting to me the other side of the world. That's mad. That doesn't fit with my worldview. So I did decide that I wanted to try this thing. So I came back and pretty much had sex on the first night, and it didn't really work out. And I remember getting this text on my phone almost the moment that I've kind of broken the vow, straight away going like, there's a problem with the film, it's not working out. I think, well, that's just coincidence. But I really wanted to make this film because I was really, really keen to explore these people. They felt fascinating. A few months go by, a few weeks go by, and then I have another encounter which basically contravenes the promise that I'd made. And I literally get another text in that moment go, oh, the film's off, it's not going to work. And I'm like, wow, two very clear coincidences.
Omens.
But there was a part of me that in that second moment, it's like, oh my God, Bruce, wow, you're the guy that's lived with tribes. You're the guy that's gone around the world. The strapline to your BBC documentary was, be one of the tribe. And it just struck me there and then. It's like, wow, you've done all these things. You've had these amazing experiences, but you've always maintained your own belief system. You've always maintained your own rational, scientific view that actually you know better. And these people have no idea. They one day they will learn and catch up, you know. Yeah. And you've always held that. Even though you've loved them, even though you've cared for them, even though you've listened to them intently, you've always maintained a bit of yourself at the back of your mind that's like, yeah, I know better. But. And I thought, fuck, why? This could just be another coincidence. Or maybe I put the hat on of allowing the possibility in that there's something very real about this. And the moment I put that hat on, of course, my entire life changed.
Synchronicity.
It's like suddenly there was meaning in everything. Suddenly there was magic in everything. Suddenly the whole world was alive in this extraordinary, rich, deep way. And so moments like that, you're like, yeah, wow. So much of it is just about how we choose to believe. And we can get very wrapped up in the sort of measuring scientific realm, think we have everything figured out. But actually, who is it that's trashing the planet? It's not them.
No, well, I can't help but try and figure these things out. For example, I know about stuff that's seemingly coincidental, but has meaning to you. I think they call that synchronicity. And if once you open your eyes to that, it's like you can find it everywhere. I had a thing with 1111 once. Wherever I looked, I saw 1111. But then I started Googling it, and you get two camps. You get the camp that says, hey, those are angels talking to you. And you get the camp like, yeah, that's confirmation bias, dude. You just look for the number everywhere and you will find it.
But if you use it in a positive way, it can probably guide you.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
I truly believe that if you are well connected to your intuition and in a belief system where you can trust and where you find comfort, that you will find omens that will guide you through life. Whether it will be confirmation bias, is that the word? Yeah. Is that what you're saying?
No, the rational explanation for something like the 1111 phenomenon, which is an actual thing. I'm not the only one who has this. And there's guys that go to the spiritual explanation, like this is the universe guiding you along, or this is just you as a pattern recognition machine that's looking for 1111, and you will find it wherever you find it.
Yeah. But I truly believe this is also like a real conditioning, because when I had a tribe leader here in my house, he wanted to make contact with somebody in Brazil to ask about his son who was in the forest, who in my opinion probably had a lung infection or something, and in his opinion he took a bad spirit from the forest. So growing up, becoming ill in the forest and just believing that you took up on a bad spirit is a whole different perception than I have a lung infection. And, having a shaman who can heal you, who can take the spirit away. And this, can you actually imagine there's somebody in his world not even thinking about a lung infection. He's just thinking about the bad spirit.
It's, it's such an interesting space. And I totally hear you about this sort of recognition, confirmation thing, because of course it's a dangerous dance. And that's why the sort of material science realm is terrified of entering into this subjective reality space, because then they think that the whole pillars of everything that's come before are just going to collapse, and there's no way of like holding on to it. It's just all going to fall apart, and it's terrifying.
Well, yeah, because if these things are actually true, we need to reconsider a lot of things we hold true very critically.
Absolutely.
And that's scary.
And so here we are, and some people are clearly buying into that. Some people buy into it so much that even no matter how much you're in this realm of belief, there's always someone a little bit more far out than you.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like there's a whole spectrum of far outness in that space. And some of the far outness is like really hard to be with because it triggers you so deeply. It's like, oh my God, that's just fucking crazy. And like, I don't want to be associated with that. And yet here we are in this room where perhaps we've had experiences that are very hard to describe. And also they have a lot of meaning to us. You know, in the film, again, I spend time, I go to India, and I have this experience when we're at the Kumbh Mela, where I'm with like 20 million sadhus rushing to the river Ganges to go for bathing. And when I'm with them, you know, so the sadhus, they're naked, they've got no possessions, and they are living with this extraordinary belief system. But one thing in that moment was that they were all focused and had been focused for weeks and weeks with very clear focus, because they got very few distractions. So their whole minds were on that river. And like, I'm amongst 20 million people whose minds are focused on the river. And I've also been meditating for a few weeks beforehand. And so I'm nothing like as focused as they are, but so all I can say is I enter into that throng of those people. And the experience I have of being with them is that literally I, as a human being, melt into the universe, and I become at one with everything that's going on.
Yeah.
And I am not even observing it. I am it. I am the universe, and I am this thing with the clouds and the trees and the plants and the river and all these human beings. I mean, we're just charging with great joy, and like I let go of all fears, and I let go of all feelings of any complication, and like the whole universe makes sense. It's like a cosmic joke, and I don't care about anything because it's all perfect, that whole thing. And there I am going towards the river. Now there's different ways of describing what that might be. Like you could just say that the scientists will say, well, you're just a momentary delusion and excitement and whatever. And but the real feeling that you have, it's like, I'm sorry, mate, that explanation is just crap. The feeling that you get is like, mate, there is something much...
It's tangible.
It's much bigger going on. And the belief system they have is that rather than, you know, the material scientists would say that this form of consciousness is just the sort of like the machinations of the material brain bringing about this state of something or other. Whereas they would say, well, actually, no, the consciousness is everything. And we're just like a transistor radio set that's just tapping into it. And then when I'm in that space, I'm tapping into this entire thing. And I can come out of myself and be a part of that because it's a very clear frequency that I'm joining. Off we go. To me, those two explanations, well, the one that's coming from those people who are doing that was a much clearer description for me of that experience than the scientific one.
Collective consciousness meltdown.
Oh, we talked about this in the podcast. I can actually, if you talk about it like that, like, well, there was this experience and maybe I did something pre-meditation that changed something in my mind or my brain at least, because we know if we get stressed, this thing starts emitting other frequencies. If we're Zen, it does the same. So maybe we can manipulate that through meditation and we tap into something bigger. We talked about this in the podcast. We have this...
maybe I am something bigger. Maybe it is beyond me, the physical.
And for a moment, the boxes fall away.
Yeah.
Or you can transcend the box, maybe. Yeah. No, we had a guy here, like the Dutch Tony Robbins, Michael Pilacic, and he does a group meditation in his seminars. And we were invited as coaches to those seminars. It was the first time I ever went to group meditation. And I talked to Wigert after this, like, what the hell was that? Because I'm a sober guy. I've done ayahuasca, and this felt like the same kind of vibe you get when you leave an ayahuasca ceremony. And it was almost tangible. So, yeah, science might not be able to explain this, but I can't ignore this because it's there.
It's a sacred space that you
Beautiful.
feel. Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yep.
And I think that we're in this space now, you know, it's like many people are having these experiences and they make very much sense. You can either go to a football match and feel like the crowd, and go, wow, that's magic, and then just come away and go, oh, it's just football, and stick it in a box and forget about it. Or you can go, well, actually, maybe there was something going on there. And there are now competing belief systems, actually, that offer different ways of understanding that. And I think that we're up for... It's an interesting moment, you know. And of course, let's not forget that not all science would deny that. Science is many different aspects and facets. It's only dogmatic material science that would deny that. Actually, science as a form of investigation should be able to allow some subjective and all the rest of it. There's no reason why science as a bigger discipline couldn't envelop this. It's only the materialists who are holding on. It's like, it's only matter that matters. Yeah. It's actually, and that's why at the end of the film we have this Ian McGilchrist, this brain scientist, when we were walking on the hills in Skye near his house, he offers this idea. He goes, clearly there's this clearly there's these competing themes of like of matter and consciousness, and like, so the sadhus I'm with, they deny the body, they deny material, they think that's nonsense. It's all about it's all about spirit, it's all about consciousness. And then on our side of the fence, we got the scientists, or some scientists who are like, well, it's got nothing to do with consciousness, it's only about matter. But clearly, well, not clearly, those two belief systems don't seem to overlap. But what if consciousness could be material as well as spirit? What if consciousness could be, as he says, like, like have different phases, like water has different phases. Water could be ice, it could be water, it could be vapor. It's still water. Maybe if consciousness can be material and matter, but also spirit, it's the same thing, and you can flow between the two, but they're actually taking different forms. That maybe is kind of an interesting avenue to explore. It's like, okay,
feels to me like looking at consciousness like the internet. It's ethereal. It really doesn't exist. If these computers would stop, like it's on computers, but at the same time, it's there, like, and you can interact with it. And maybe consciousness is something like that. Maybe it needs a brain as a power source in order to exist, but at the same time, or to manifest in a certain way. Because what is the internet other than electricity gone through, a computer and made websites? Maybe this is a little bit of the same.
Yeah.
So
everything has a frequency and a vibe and a sound, and it's all connected to each other. Everything. If you look at nature, everything makes a sound for a reason. Same in your documentary. They were actually. It was funny where they were talking about the bird when they used the bird as a watch. I recognize it. Like some birds are start beeping at 4 o'clock, and they know it's time to go home.
But we're actually venturing into these because you said like there's this divide between one side the spiritual world and the other side the scientific world. What I'm very happy about, and maybe we can talk about that a little. For example, next week we're going to talk to Michael Pollan.
Okay.
And he wrote a big book about psychedelics and the influence that has
on
specifically these themes.
Yes. Does he? I haven't read the book. It sounds amazing.
Yeah. And the thing is that we talked a little bit about this before the podcast, that the stigma that's attached to psychedelics, entheogenics is kind of fading away. Microdosing is becoming very popular. I don't know if you heard about this.
Yeah, of course.
So that seems sort of like a gateway through these insights. And one of the themes through your work also has been, well, not shying away from these experiences. When you look at the way you look at the world right now and these, let's say, entheogenic experience that you had, was that pivotal as well? Did that help you?
Absolutely. I think, and it's also taken me a little while to have the courage to say this too, because a long time I was like BBC chap and, and knew that if I was just shouting from the rooftops, like these things are great, that's a dangerous message to be putting in the world without the caveats of the complications and all the rest of it. So it's never a quick one, but for myself, absolutely the times that I've taken various different plant medicines have been almost without exception the most positive healing experiences of my life. They've given me so much, and they've allowed me to grow and have insight and clarity so much. I've healed deep traumas that I didn't even realize I had. And the type of person that I am as a result of going through those wonderful experiences has gained in immeasurable ways, especially in my relationships. My relationships with each other, with my friends and my family, which were often very troubled and difficult, have all harmonized, or increasingly harmonizing, still work to go. And also especially my relationship with nature. I've had a very much deeper and more profound respect and connection to nature.
Those two are basically everything.
That's life.
That's life. That's everything. What really stuck in my mind was I saw you in one of the documentaries going to Africa, Gabon, I think, for the Iboga. Yeah. And at one point, the camera crew was sent away because there was going to happen something that wasn't allowed to be filmed. Yeah. Can you recap, or do you want to share in your memory what happened from that point on? Maybe you can describe the whole scenery.
Yeah. So basically, this was the first documentary for the Tribe series I made. So we didn't know what we were going to do, and like the crew were like, the director was like, Bruce, you don't have to do. They invited me to come and do this like ritual iboga, which is a strong entheogen, And they were like, you don't have to do this, you know. And I was like, well, I've been invited. I think I should. It'd be really nice. But I didn't really know what to expect. Anyway, long story short, the whole village is set up. I have to sign this declaration because they're kind of half in our world and half not in it.
They have a waiver.
So I had a waiver because
don't let the white man die.
it was a chief from because they normally put the word out to the other villages that we're going to have a celebration because it's like a rite of passage. So they put the word out, and this chief from another village came and he goes, who was closer to the civilized world, or it's our world, let's say, less civilized world, and he's like, no, you might kill this guy because we've never done it to a white guy before, so you have to sign it. So the disclaimer I wrote was to say that I wasn't a witch, which I just thought was genius because, like, what disclaimer? Which court law is that going to work in? Anyway, so I signed this disclaimer to promise that I wasn't a witch. Anyway, I went through the ritual, and I mean, I could talk for days about what happened, but say the first 8-10 hours is eating the root, which is probably the hardest thing I've ever done. It's like chipboard soaked in battery acid, and you're not allowed to drink, and you're just eating this wood for hours and hours and hours. It's horrible. And then you stop vomiting. Then the crew left, and then I'm left on my own with what I call my Bwiti father, 2 or 3 people in the hut singing and chanting and rattling. And the rest of the village are outside preparing for the next 2 days of party. Meanwhile, I'm in there. And yeah, I'm not allowed to talk about all of what happened, and especially certain things that I saw. But what was fascinating was that similarly to ayahuasca, I went through the process of seeing myself through alternate prisms and getting an objective of myself that allowed you to realize this is who you are, this is what you're really like. Like, for example, I had one occasion, talk about empathy. I had one occasion when I went back into the room of a girlfriend who was actually sadly very ill at the time. And we were in our house in London, and I remember being there in myself, seeing everything, seeing her, and then her saying to me, "I love you, babe." And then me coming out of my body, going up to the room, to the ceiling of the room, looking down on both of us, and then watching me turn away. And then I went into her body and looked out through her eyes at me as I then say, "Yeah, I love you too, babe," but I clearly didn't mean it. And feeling her heart break from inside her body, and then so all the power and difficulty that went through reliving that experience. And those sorts of things happened quite a lot. So quite a lot of things like that were giving me insights into myself and my decisions and all that sort of stuff. And then I met deities and flew and da-da-da. But what was fascinating was every time I came out of one of these dreamscapes, and then they would say to me, "What did you see?" And I've described, well, I had this thing and I saw this thing, and they were like, shake their heads, like a bit disappointed. "What did you see?" And then I'd be like, and then I described this other thing, and they're like, "What did you?" And then I'd go back into sleep and have another dream, and then come out and then describe all these things that I thought I was seeing, and they just never seemed to be that interested. And then I'm like, well, but I'm like seeing these shapes and things too, and they're like, "What did you see?" And then I would see, because they would never lead in questions. They would only ever ask, "What did you see?" And then I was like, well, they seemed much more excited about these things. So I was like, well, I saw these things, and they look like this, and they spin like that, and they flash like this, and they glow like that. And they're like, "Boucle!" And then name it, and all clap together. And I'm like, what the fuck? They're not interested in the slightest in my stuff.
That is your problem.
These like little signposts along the way as to see where it was that I was going. Isn't that interesting?
That's kind of reminiscent of when I did my ayahuasca ceremony. I saw these fractals appear, and there seem to be different types. And what you're saying is they know the fractals, and they probably know where you are in your journey.
Who knows? Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. Wow.
And then they were like, and then I said later, because I was talking to the guy who's interpreting and stuff, and I was like, and then he asked, I said, well, what about all my difficulties? He goes, "Oh yeah, it's known that people have some difficult stuff."
The damaged goods, we knew this already.
It's like, whatever, you'll figure all that shit out. But how funny.
Yeah, it's funny that that's what I noticed from a good shaman, that he guides you through the process, but he's not making his hands dirty on your problems. Like, your shit, you take care of it. And I remember a funny quote in the forest where I felt very lonely, and I kind of went to the shaman for a pat on the back. And I told him I was really lonely, and he's like, "Well, you get to know yourself when you're lonely, so off you go."
Good luck with that. Yeah.
I felt like, okay, I got to do it by myself here. And,
Beautiful. I saw someone wearing a T-shirt once like "Everything is medicine," and I just love that. I think that's such a great little bumper sticker. It's like everything is medicine. Doesn't matter how, and you look at your own life, it's like, we've all had difficulties, but actually there's always something very beautiful that's often come out, just depending on how you want to look at your life and how you want to look at these things. But if you can accept that everything is a learning, and even the really difficult stuff has some spin that can be seen as positive. I mean, that's obviously, you could say that's just a privileged white male Anglo-Saxon guy's take on things, and actually be born in a North Korean prison camp and you wouldn't have that philosophy. And so I accept that that might not be something that applies everywhere, and there may be privilege in that view,
but it's helped me. It's definitely in the small things. And you were just talking about the conversation you had with your ex-girlfriend where you say I love you but you don't mean it. A few weeks ago I was in America on a marketing event, and there was also a voice coach on stage. He was talking about how to have a leading presentation, a leading voice, but he was also explaining how the voice as an energy comes out of you, and how you speak, and with the emotion that you put behind it, and how it is received by somebody else's brain. Because when it gets into the ear, it first gets to the amygdala, which is attached to your emotions. So we probably are not even aware of it, but on the deepest level, we can really feel the power of a word and of the tonation. And obviously that's also, when I got ill in the forest, I had 3 Indians around me singing Icaros, because that's the way of healing they use for thousands of years. And having the forest around you, all the sounds, there's a reason why people get at ease in the forest, because of all the insects and the things and the buzzing, and just calms you down. So that the power of the word is the power of sound is actually really healing.
I had a voice coach once. I was doing a clown course to get over some fears I had, which is terrifying. But anyway, that's by the way.
Did you see it at a young age, maybe?
Is that why you started doing ridiculous shit on television?
It was actually because of me doing ridiculous shit. I had to do the clown course to get over like having this crazy image of perfection that I needed to break through, and that's another whole story. But in the clown course, which was 2 months long, right by my house in Ibiza, there was every morning we would do different types of therapy work, and for a 2-week period we had this great, actually I think he's Dutch, wonderful voice coach who came along, and so we were just doing sort of song and sort of voice and sound therapy. Anyway, there's one occasion where we're all in a circle and we're all clapping and singing, and people, if they wanted to, jump in the middle and then sing their bit and whatever. And I, I was always scared of doing these things, but one time I was like, fuck it, I've got to do it. So I jumped in the middle and then did this like la 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 la, whatever it was, and then get back out, and the next person comes in on it. And at the end of that session, the coach said to me, Bruce, I spotted something in you. Do you mind if I explore that a little bit? And I'm like, yeah, cool, man. So he got everyone to sit down, and he got the piano, and then I'm stood there, and he goes, just sing like you were singing in that circle. And I'm like, okay, yeah, sure. I was like, la 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 la. And then he found a note, and he goes, that one there, can you hold that? And I'm like, ah, and then no, it wasn't. That would have been like ah, and he was like, push harder. It's like ah, push harder, ah, and suddenly, because I'm now like really pushing this note out, I promise you, out of absolutely nowhere, it completely shocked me. Suddenly, I am just bawling my eyes out.
My God.
Yeah.
I am just crying and crying and crying. Like the tears could start flooding out of me, and I'm getting images of the tar sands, of the forest destruction, of all of the things that I've seen on my journeys where nature has been turned over, and all the people as well that have had this really difficult time. And essentially, somehow locked within me is I'm carrying, let's say, the energy, the memory of these experiences that I've had, and this vibration of me whatever it is, maybe it's just some cavity that's maybe holding this that I'm unlocking through the vibration. But I hadn't been thinking about those things consciously for a long time. But him finding that vibration brought it all to the surface.
Have you ever heard of Rolfing?
Yes, but no, I've heard the name.
We spoke about Steve Maxwell a little before
Yes.
the podcast, right? One of his things was Rolfing, which is basically a form of, I think it's called myofascial release, where you have muscular structures which
Yes.
are like totally cramped up. They release that. It's very, it's a hard way of massaging.
Yes.
But usually when people go through that, they have similar emotional releases
Yes.
because what happens is if you go through something traumatic or that kind of stops or you get distracted, you store that energy somewhere in your body because it's just an unfinished reflex.
Of course.
And that kind of builds up.
Totally agree.
And I think that if you hit a certain note, maybe the same like with the mantras, you might vibrate certain parts of your body and maybe that releases it.
I think that makes a lot of sense, you know, and like, I was wondering what, it's Wolfing, yeah?
Rolfing.
Yeah, I have heard that term, and that makes a lot of sense to me. And I mean, you look at animals after they've been chased by a lion, and you see the shaking out of all of that sort of like adrenaline, flight or fight sort of hormonal release. And we have so much stress in our lives, and we have no tools and methods for getting these things out. It's no surprise to me that we've got little muscles that are all tight and knotted. And I've certainly felt that in my meditations of going in and finding things. And also, I think our neural pathways, you know, other cultures fully accept that our emotions are stored in our stomach, our intuitions are in our heart, and our brain is for analytical thought. And that makes a lot of sense to them. And for us, it's like only up in the head. And I've spoken to a number of shamans in the past who've dealt with Westerners a lot. And I've often said, like, okay, you've done hundreds of ceremonies with loads and loads of you know, Europeans and North Americans. What is the biggest single problem that you see us all having? And they would all say the same thing. It's like, you're all in the head. You're all just stuck in the head. And these other groups know that actually the heart and the stomach and the whole body is an integrated system, and that all of this stuff needs to be healthy too, you know, and we're not. We're like so knotted and tight. And I think that's what you notice when you do things like ayahuasca is sometimes you'll relive a memory of some trauma that's happened to you, and you'll get a physiological response, and you can relive it from the perspective of being a more mature, wiser person, and release some of that stored up, pent up, like fear or trauma or whatever it is. And it really genuinely feels like that. You're letting it out. And then also you're rewiring your neural circuitry to not react in the same way, because you're like, okay, that's why I'm behaving like that as a defense mechanism, or it's whatever because of that thing.
Yeah.
And you have a moment to be able to do that rewiring.
I think that's why, especially ayahuasca and iboga are very, very useful tools in combating addiction. I think it actually raises your neuroplasticity and the highway you made in your head on your neurological system. It kind of dissipates and you can build new roads.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm probably mutilating it, but
better
something
way
like
of
that.
saying
Yeah.
what I was trying to say.
Yeah.
No, I think that my own experience of doing that. I mean, I went back and relived my own birth.
What was that like?
Very, very weird. But
I can imagine.
So I had done like a meditation retreat or something, and I'd noticed something in my gut, and then I was meditating on it on a daily basis, and so there's something like behind my belly button. Something behind my belly button that was like what felt like a little electrical pulse that was, and because I was meditating, I was able to feel it, and it was moving around. And then so I was kind of having interest in my daily meditations to sort of chase this thing around my body. And then around that time, something else started happening to me, was that I was then getting these nightmares when I'd wake up in the night, and I was having this type of, it wasn't like a nightmare of visions, it was a nightmare of like waking up, like choking almost. And it was, I sort of described it as if I couldn't breathe, I couldn't swallow, and I was like trying to regurgitate an egg, but I couldn't. It was like this sort of experience. Really, really weird. But the weirdest thing was that I remembered, when I was a child, like a really young child, I used to have this type of nightmare all the time, and I've totally forgotten about it in like the last 30 years. It's like this is coming back to me because of something that's going on. Anyway, just so happens that around that time I'm doing a ceremony in Colombia, and so I'm doing all of this sort of meditation work, and these things are happening to me, and then I go into a ceremony, and I basically in the course of that ceremony go back into the womb, and I'm reborn. And this whole thing around my neck and in my belly button is like playing out. And I'm like, fuck, that's what it is. And it's all to do with my birth. And I remember then speaking to my mum like months later, saying, Mum, I had this weirdest thing, and a weird thing to tell you about, but I had this vision of being born again. She goes, oh yeah, I don't know if I ever told you. When you were born, the umbilicus was around your neck. I had to stop the contractions. We had to cut it off. And you went blue, this whole thing. And you're like, how weird is that?
That's mysterious. Whenever I hear about stories about ayahuasca, stuff like this makes me like, well, there must be something to this. Because
I mean, why not? But I see that there is a rational explanation for that. Why isn't it that most important moment of my life was stored in me somehow? Why isn't it that I came into this world with this sort of like very difficult passage? And what I forgot to mention that is the most important bit is that in the ayahuasca, so I have this ball of energy that's behind my belly button. I have these sort of like choking things. This whole thing comes, and then I vomit it all out. I vomit it all out. And I promise you, from one day to the next, I wanted to run around the room and shake everyone's hands and go, something's changed inside me that's so big, I feel like a completely different human being. And what I realized was that actually the big thing that shifted in me in that stage was I used to have a fear of something, and that had gone. But that fear had played out in ways in my life where I used to like kind of shout people down a bit. And it's so weird. I mean, it would take me a while to find the thread to tell you exactly why it is that particular thing brought about that particular behavior. But I promise you, after that experience of throwing that up, I noticed in myself, wow, I'm not doing that anymore. It was like, wow, something deep has changed in me. I mean, I used to remember, say, for example, having meetings where I had a little bit of voice, like suddenly coming to with the whole room like staring at me, and me realized, God, I've just had a rant and I didn't even know. And I don't do that anymore. Or not as much.
It's in the nature. Yeah, I get it. Well, I find it, I always wonder when I hear these things, I'm always like, wow, you are such a result of everything that happened to you. The subconscious behavior that you manifested because of that one trauma at the beginning of your life probably set the course of your life in so many subtle ways.
Which I have to be grateful for too. I was speaking to a wise friend of mine because I remember like that, and also the next day sort of battling because there was a little bit left and I wanted to get it out, and I kind of almost demonized it and was like, get this thing out of me. I don't want it anymore. And then a friend of mine was like, Bruce, don't forget that thing that you're now sort of demonizing and all the rest of it, maybe you have to actually come to peace with it and thank it in some ways. It's like you are who you are as a result of all the things that have happened to you, good and bad. And like, look at your life, it's amazing.
Yep.
And so, yes, maybe you've had some fear. Maybe that's altered your behavior. Maybe you've lost some empathy. Maybe it wasn't, maybe there's a whole bunch of reasons. But actually, that would have also served you too. So don't just hate it, and that was really helpful, and it actually did allow me to let more go.
Yeah, if you go back to Mr. Peterson, he is very adamant about a little bit of fear is very good. It's very good to have something of that you don't want, or at least feel an urgency, because if you don't act, something bad will happen. It's very good motivational tool,
nice.
if you can sense that. What I find so amazing about these stories is the fact that, and I've heard. Obviously entheogens, medicine, but I also heard it be called technology, because it's so very, special that there's apparently these roots and these vines that you can take, and they have all these almost magical properties in the way you perceive the world and your consciousness develops. And they seem to be global, right? This is a phenomenon, and they all have their different kinds of entheogens, but all these tribes usually have something similar. Which is a question?
I mean, we were saying earlier about how things like whether it's plant medicines or yoga or meditation or chanting, or you could put them all in the same bracket as a technology for reconnection, if you want. That would be some way that if I had to like write one sentence, I would perhaps say, you could say they're technologies. And like all of these terms can get a bit loose. Like what's a shaman, like what is technology? All of this sort of stuff it can be a bit loose if it's not defined well. I mean, you could even say fire is a technology. I mean, like technology goes back a long, long way. So a lot of it depends on the way that we want to define these terms. But yeah, I think that.
Well, what they're usually hinting at when they say technology, this is something that was put here by higher powers to make us connect to them.
Well, in that case, that's subtly different because I would always have considered technology to be something that's created more in the human realm. If it's something that's coming about as a result of a higher power, well, then you're entering into a whole nother level. I do find it interesting. It's like, why are certain plants putting in a lot of energy into creating certain compounds? That's interesting, because generally when you look at most of the makeup of most things, there's a reason for it. And so why is this plant creating something that interacts with us in such a way that does this? Now, you can ask that question and come up with 1,000 different answers. I personally like the answer. I like the idea that perhaps there is some feedback loop whereby it sees that we need that and that it will help us to reconnect. I mean, like that, why not? And like, of course there's no way of knowing that. There's no way of proving that. And we could waffle on about it for weeks, but I have come to believe in my life that there's so much unexplained mystery and wonder out there. And I like it remaining in the realm of mystery and wonder. It brings about something inside of me that reminds me that I can't control nature, that I'm not bigger than nature, that I am part of it. It humbles me and it makes me feel amazing. And I'd much rather that and hold on to that, the mystery of it, than think that I can like know it all and control it all, because that leads to all sorts of problems.
Or it could inspire more awe. If you talk about, for example, the way we treat this world, we are mucking up this world. But if we would discover that there's actually some connection between us and our environment, and this seems to produce something that makes us change our behavior, because that's a common thread in people who do entheogens, like we need to take care of this planet. What if it's a plant consciousness way, because there's a lot of investigation going on there. Plants seem to be smarter than we think they are. So maybe that's their way of giving feedback to us. And that was the question I was working towards. I've heard it say, and maybe you can talk about this, that, for example, ayahuasca, shrooms, or iboga, they all seem to have this very particular local flavor. So if you take psilocybin, there's a lot of Mexican patterns, for example. And if you take ayahuasca, there's the jaguar, the condor, the snake. My girlfriend recently did an ayahuasca experience. She knew nothing about the whole lore, not in the way that we do. She saw the condor, she saw the jaguar, she saw the snake. There's a pattern there. She didn't know about this. So there's no cultural bias there. So that kind of makes me wonder, is there something in that plant that's talking regionally? It has like a dialect or something. Is that something you recognize?
That's, you know what? I haven't had that localization as strongly as that. I've definitely had my jaguar and anaconda moments with ayahuasca. But I've also had like Aztec stuff and various things. And I've, yes, I think that if I step back and really analyze all the different experiences I heard in different parts of the world, that there probably has been more occasions when what you're saying fits, but I do have a lot of knowledge of these things, so it may well be that I am bringing that into the space. I find that sort of level of inquiry something that I can't really answer definitively. It's possible, but it's not so. I don't have an experience that's gone, yes, I absolutely think that because of X, Y, and Z. It's like, yeah, maybe, But there's another times where I think that if I blindfolded myself and took a little drop of any one of those substances, I don't know actually if I would be able to tell which one was which anyway. I mean, like,
because it's similar.
Because there are so many similarities, and I think that often the similarities are, for me, actually closer than this sort of localization aspect. And so, yeah, I mean, maybe I should explore more.
We should, yes. We should do more research, and well, I think there are actually websites that do it. There is a sort of bestiary where people write down all the ayahuasca experience that they ever heard about, and they can sort of like, oh, this is the octopods, and here are the kidnapping aliens, and here's the spiders, and here's the snakes. There's like these.
You can go down so many rabbit holes there, though. You can go down so.
What would be the most interesting one for you? What's one that pops to mind?
In all honesty, the most interesting one for me is the healing, because we've all got lots of friends who do a lot of entheogens, and they're out there in the Akashic fields trying to figure out the life, the universe, and everything, and that's great. But actually, to me, the real work is here. The real work is in our own bodies, trying to unlock our traumas so that we can be better human beings to each other and the planet. That's the work. And like, we can all there's a little bit of like mental masturbation going on with all of that other realm. And of course that's great. And we're all up for it, but not alone.
No.
Not just that, because that shit, you can get lost in that wormhole forever. I think the real answers are inside us. The real answers about being incarnated in this world. And this is where the work needs to be done. And yes, we'll all go back out to the amorphous blob and have the most wonderful continuation at one stage. But look, we're here on this planet. It's amazing. Let's keep it going. Let's not fuck it up.
One term, though, that triggered me. The archaic fields?
Yeah, so I had the word a minute ago. What did I call it? The Akashic Records. You've heard of that?
Well, it triggers something, but
Akashic
what exactly?
Right?
What is it?
Well, there's all sorts of, depending on the philosophy, but one of the ideas that what the Akashic realm might be is whereby every bit of information that's ever been is also held in every tiniest molecule that's ever been.
Morphic resonance.
Kind of morphic resonance, a little bit. What's his name? Irvin Laszlo talks about this, and a few other people. It's like, so it's like the memory of everything and the knowing of everything is everywhere, and you can tap into it at any point. And so these are just competing thoughts and philosophies for what the whole thing's about. Universal sort of like theories of everything. But so like some people will enter into that realm, going like, I can undo these places and find all the answers, really. And I think there's something in that, but like I said, I'm much more interested in
the here and now.
Yeah. Reminds me of a shaman who told me when I asked him, it's always a bad thing to compare shamans. Like for an ayahuasca experience is never the same. How many you've done, and I had one shaman and I had a proven shaman before, and they have different styles. I was trying to compare and trying to figure out the language, the Icaros, and I asked him, like, you sing different Icaros, but can you understand the Peruvian Icaros? He's like, well, we don't speak the same language, but when we're in the space, I know what it's about.
Yeah, beautiful.
And it's really interesting. The world of Icaros is a special thing.
We've all had the great privilege of drinking with different people in different cultures and different places, and a lot of the songs, the guitar songs and the word songs, are all wonderful. But when someone sings true Icaro, which is not so much about words, but it's more about sounds, for me that just goes straight to the source. It's like, wow, that's the real magic there.
Yeah, you were actually yesterday on stage we were talking about the masculine energy and the feminine energy. Important in these tribes, and I remember being baptized in January in a ritual, 4-day ritual, where I had to be one of the parts was laying in your hammock for 24 hours, laying straight, setting you for a new life, going straight. And if you would be this in your hammock, then you would be dead for the rest of your life, going through life.
Oh wow!
Yeah, it was interesting.
Oh my god!
And that was after a day of the football kind of moves, like holding each other, dragging each other. So it was, you were made very tired, and that was the part where you were able to rest. But you couldn't rest because there were little girls from 6 to 12-year-old singing to you. And I can't. My camera just fucked up here, so I'm using my iPhone to film me, but I have the song on my iPhone, and it's like a little song, na 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 na. And in the beginning, you're in your hammock, and you'll be like, this is nice. What if it goes on for 24 hours? I think it went on for 12 hours, and the men were chanting on the back, and it's all building this energy. And it was the first time not using ayahuasca, but seeing the fractals, and just after a few hours, it broke my brain. I just couldn't handle it anymore, and the singing just went on, and that's definitely where they use their feminine and masculine energies to reset something or something. It was a rite of passage as well to go from young boy to man.
Wow.
And that's where I thought, like, okay, I know so little about this. You know? I can drink all the ayahuasca I want. I didn't even drink ayahuasca, but it was a ritual without ayahuasca.
Beautiful.
So you're just there and 4 hours in the same experience that you're telling about people going into darkness. I just looked into it to actually find a retreat where you can go into darkness for 3 days because the melatonin stops producing and just DMT starts flowing. Imagine you've been living in a cave for 27 years, DMT.
No worries, man. I have a basement. You can come to my place. I'll lock you up.
I understand you heard the word of God, you know? And I really love the mystics from India that in your documentary. They were not talking about any spiritual plans or whatsoever. They're just about truth, you know. That I guess it's your intuition just talking, your soul talking to you. It's a beautiful concept.
Can we talk initiation rituals a bit? You went through a few.
Yeah.
Some more fun than others.
Sure.
There's one in particular with the Kambai tribe that gets a particular mention. Want to share?
You want that one, do you? That wasn't so much an initiation. I think, well, no, I'm going to ask you, what are you talking about?
I think they weren't very specific in the description, but it seemed like they were doing some uncomfortable stuff to genitals.
Okay.
Yeah.
I knew that's where you're going. Okay, I just wanted to
Obviously, we want the spectacles.
In case, imagine me telling that story, you're like, no, Bruce, that's not what we were actually asking about. Okay, so, no, that wasn't an initiation, but what I did find so often with where I used to go and live with these wonderful people was... They really did enjoy me kind of living in their homes and eating their food and kind of like for a little period of time trying to like be like them a little bit. And you know, and from the outside that felt a bit awkward, a bit weird. It's like, are they going to be offended by this? Am I getting, it's like wannabe tribes guy who's just like, but they really genuinely nearly always were like so excited that rather than just driving by and taking photos of the car, like people might have had experiences of people before just passing through, that I genuinely wanted to eat their food and drink their drinks and like put on their clothes and be with them and like, you know, be a part of it. And they loved it. And they're like, surely you want to go and live with the crew who are out there like eating spag bol and drinking wine. Like, no, I'm really happy here in the community with you. And they always enjoyed that. And so the thing you're talking about in the Kombai was basically, so I was living with these three guys in a tree house. And they were inviting me to basically go through these layers of being more and more like them. So one time I stuck this sago thorn through my nose, and the guy loved that. And that night he was like sort of sign language to me as the fire was going down. Like, if you come back and you're not wearing the sago thorn, I don't want to know you. You know, you've got to keep the sago thorn in. And so, you know, he was really into it. But that same guy, this is a prelude to the story, really loved me. Like, really loved me. And so that particular clip of what we're about to talk about, where the thing that happens next is what you don't know because it's not on the film, is that he's super into me, and he like comes on to me in the treehouse at night and his hands are all over me and I have to move him off and all the rest of it. So he made advances. So he made advances to me in the treehouse, and like he's the sweetest, most lovely guy. But then the following morning when we go through this last thing, now you've heard me say that, you can see his face again. You go, oh, that's why he's so excited about what he's about to do, because basically what these guys do is they're naked. They wear a bit of rattan around their waist, which they use for lighting fires, and they have a bow and maybe 2 arrows, and that's it. Yeah. So when they're running through the forest, though, your balls, like, they have their own sort of equilibrium. They don't really get in the way, but dicks, as all guys know, just like flap around, and they're kind of, when you're naked running around, it's just a bit annoying, and you don't want that shit getting caught in a thorn or anything. So they have to figure out ways of dealing with it. So in that particular part of the world, quite often they will stick them into like a hollowed out gourd, like a dried out vegetable that's like long and thin that they grow, and they stick them into that. So they wear these penis gourds and then tie them up. And so and then different tribes have different size and shape ones, and it's hilarious, like sort of dick gourd competitions going on around the
hierarchy.
Dick hierarchy. Yeah. I mean, like, literally some of them have these huge things, like, you know, fatter than your leg, like coming up. And they keep their like, tobacco in the top of it and stuff. So either they do that, or the other thing they do is they literally tuck the dick back inside the body.
Yeah.
And that's what this guy was going to do to me. So literally, after having him come onto me in the treehouse, like a naked cannibal wearing a vegetable coming onto me in the fucking treehouse the night before, and then the next morning, he's
sounds kind of exciting.
It could be a dream for something.
The next morning, so there he is. He's like, whips my shorts down and grabs hold of my dick, and then I'm like, I don't want to push him away because I love this guy, he's amazing, but I have to go through two translators to say, you know, please, what's going on? But in the meantime, he's already at it. So if you imagine you had a sausage roll and you squeezed it really hard, the meat would shoot. Yeah. So like, basically, he rolls over my foreskin tight, and then he holds my foreskin tight, and then he grabs my dick and he looks up at me and he just goes like that. And then I feel it basically coming back inside my body, and it's like the weirdest experience.
You can do that?
It's like, it's what the hell? and so I'm like,
the expression on my face is probably
my God, it's like, what is really going on? And so like, all I remember is like wanting to push the guy away. It's not painful, but I felt completely like I'm about to faint. So I look over and I got the camera literally inches away from my face. And then I got the director who's talking to me, but I can't hear a word he's saying because I'm ringing, my ears are ringing, and like I'm pouring with sweat.
Wow.
And I look at myself later, I'm white as a sheet, and I'm going to faint. So I like lay down. If you're going to faint, you've got to lay down to get the blood to your head. So I lay down to put my legs in the air to get the blood. So you got this image, thank God didn't make it to the final show, like me with half my dick missing, lying down with my legs in the air, fucking naked, like completely white as fuck. Yeah. So I think that's what you were getting
in
at.
this journey, are you like, what the hell am I doing here? I need to go home. Look at that grinning camera guy.
But like, you know, I meet people occasionally who's like, who are just in the streets around like different parts of the world, and like, oh, you remember that thing? You know, I tried that, and I'm like, you what? Why would you want to do that? That's so weird.
Yeah. So, but this wasn't really an initiation
No,
ritual?
this was just him wanting me to sort of like go down the process of being like him.
Did kind of answer one of my questions, though. I was wondering about in tribes if there's something like homosexuality and how they actually deal with it. Apparently, it's pretty open there, and they don't.
Well, I think again, you know, I haven't spent long enough in any of these groups to be able to answer that definitively. But I have read quite a lot, and I've spoken to many people who've spent decades with these groups. But very few people have spent decades with lots of groups, you know. So I have a particular niche in the market of having visited many, and then other people have much more knowledge of one group for a long period of time. And I think that clearly there's homosexuality and all sorts of different ways of enjoying sex and relationships in all of these groups. And so I think that it is there, and there's definitely, it's there. I haven't come across it very often, but I have no doubt that it's evident.
There are some.
Well, again, it's just all depending on the culture, and so it's very easy in this particular area to generalize. It's the same with relationships. You know, like the type of relationship is so different in all of these groups. I mean, I've been with polygamous and polyandrous and every type of relationship and family structure that's out there. I've pretty much come across. You know, where women have more than one husband, where it's much more open, and women can have husbands and men can have women, or where it's much more monogamous, and so they're all out there. And I think so much of that will depend on the environment, and the structure of hereditary, who's passing on what and which line it goes down. You know, that's when it gets incredibly complicated. I think that in that area, though, that, as you know, the groups that I'm most interested in now are these egalitarian groups. And that's where I feel that there's this sort of insight into something, because there's no coercion. There's no one being told, oh, you've got to wear blue and you've got to wear, there's no coercion in these spaces. People are basically free to be whatever they want to be. And yet, and there really is no coercion. I mean, of course, nature has its own limiting factor on society, not being very easy to exist outside of the society has its own limiting factor. So I'm not saying there's no conditioning. Everyone is still conditioned, because of course all humans are conditioned from your upbringing, but it doesn't seem to be a conditioning that is forcing one way or another. It seems to be a very free form of allowing. And yet what I did notice in those groups were there was actually quite a strong division between the men and the women, and a division in labor and a division in activity. And although I must remind you at this moment that that everyone's the same in equality terms. People are different, and differences are respected, and differences are even celebrated. And there's differences between individuals, and there's also differences between men and women. But there's no one who is above or below. Everyone is respected equally. Everyone has equal valid say. Everyone is honored similarly. So that's what we were talking earlier about, equality and sameness. That they are equal, but they're not the same.
Yeah.
And so in that space, to come back to your question about sexuality and stuff, no, there was actually quite a strong movement towards this binary view of sex and gender, and that's been a very hard thing to be with in that being my understanding. And then, of course, living in today's world where we have a very, very different view of that. And that wouldn't matter at all, except that one of the things that we didn't talk about earlier, as far as these tools for egalitarianism, like we talked about the hunter being brought down and all this sort of stuff. But one of the other tools that was really evident to me was actually the play between the men and the women. That was a very, very, very prominent tool that was being used, especially in that African group, for how they managed to maintain balance and equality within the society. And this is hot water that I'm putting myself in a little bit now, because I'm only just trying to repeat the experience of being there and what I saw. I don't want to extrapolate that out into what's natural and what's not natural.
It's your experience.
This is just an experience, but it was fascinating to me that there was clearly a different quality of being, of power, of essence between those two groups. And it doesn't mean to say that there weren't masculine women and that there weren't feminine men, and that of course there's graduations between those two groups, but there did seem to be a divide. And that divide was this playing between the poles of these two energies was something that maintained the balance. So, for example, I mentioned earlier about this ritual that reminded them of the time when they outcast the alpha male and brought in the other men, and this was how it was. But it seems that also that ritual they do rarely, but it does happen. But what they do much more frequently is these other rituals whereby basically, for example, the women come together on a regular basis as a group in the center of the community and then hold to account male behavior. And they're hold to account but they do it in their own manner of power and strength, which is much more playful. It's much more song and dance and jovial. It's a lot of teasing. It's very sexual too. It's like a little bit of, we know what you guys want, but if you don't behave, you're not going to get it kind of essence beneath the surface, But because they're together as a solidarity within the center of the group, you feel that they are unified as one, and then the men are just kind of receiving it, and they're being teased, and actually you can look at the website under Benjeli, spelled Mbenjeli, but this group, you see the women and how much they are holding space and how powerful they are. And then the men will come in later and then they'll do their bit. But what for me that was so fascinating was like, okay, their way of maintaining balance within that society is they kind of knew intuitively or with their own wisdom that if they tried to challenge the power of the male sort of hierarchy and dominance and competition and aggression with the same sort of power, that they would lose. That you can't fight that with the same. And when you look at our own history of revolutions trying to take out hierarchy, they've always just, if it's been a bloody revolution, they've always just ended up replacing the same with the same. No matter how well-meaning that revolution may have started, if they come in with the same quality of power to take it out, they just end up replacing it. Whereas here is this extraordinary insight into a tool for maintaining balance, whereby the women are using a very different quality. They're not challenging the men, using the same power and hierarchy and aggression and competition. They're using a very different, it's like teasing and play and joy and threat of removal of something that the men want. And this is an incredibly powerful tool in its own right. If everyone comes together, when the women came together and held in solidarity, it's like, fuck you. Don't get out of hand. Don't be a lazy lover in the bedroom. Stop beating your wife up behind closed doors. Whatever it is, we are one as a solidarity. And I thought, wow, for me, that was like, that's something that needs to come back into our knowledge and understanding. And it's like, but the trouble with that message, even though for me it just gives me goosebumps to see to remember and feel the power of those women. Of course, it's a message that interrupts and questions some of the direction that we're going in at the moment. And like, I don't know how to sort of square that circle, or I don't know what it is that I'm carrying. I don't want to be. I love the idea where we're at now of this whole sort of spread of sex and gender, and like, I don't want to be bringing something that interrupts that. I'm a liberal at heart. But there it is. There's the conundrum. Here's this amazing thing that I experienced that seemed to be a tool for bringing about equality and bringing about a reduction in the runaway power of the sort of like the hierarchical space, which we're in now. And here's something that's like, wow, God, wouldn't that be an amazing thing to bring into the world, to offer as an insight, to empower? And of course, we're seeing that in many ways in our society with the Me Too movement and all the rest of it. But still, there's this, it needs to be unified somehow, and like that's how it worked.
Maybe there's something we can learn from that strategy when dealing with the issues that arise when we go broadly in this spectrum.
I think so, and I think it doesn't have to be necessarily just but I as a man can also adopt a similar sort of strategy to deal with power in my life by removing myself from it, not feeding it, and so this removal aspect is part of it. But there was the sexual aspect was also really interesting. That seemed to be like, what's the driving force here?
Schoolie pooping. It usually is.
Well, it's the product of the environment that tries to change this environment. That's a weird thing, right? Like the product itself, you get confused about this environment and you want to bring change to it. But that's a tough cookie. If you stay in the environment of England, Wales, where you want to live, and just one more question about this connecting with each other. I found that in many tribes, connection also was a big part in cannibalism, right? Cannibalism.
Okay.
Yeah. Eating the elders to stay connected with them. I've read about many tribes. Some burn them and put them into banana mixes and eat them. And I can't really imagine somebody eating a leg over the fire. But did you experience any special cannibalism encounters in your journeys?
Yeah, I did actually, and
Human tastes great.
Human tastes great. I've eaten a bit of human
something
before.
that we didn't see on television?
It's one of these words again that's so taboo, and like again another word that I've got friends who've eaten their placentas and stuff. So they're like, what is cannibalism? Is it just eating human flesh? What does it mean?
Well, that's why I brought up the connection part, because usually it's about that.
Yeah. So there are many different ways of being a cannibal, if you will, or eating human flesh, because I think the word is so loaded. We've got the Asterix image of someone staring in a pot and and all that aggressive aspect, and it's not always that. So the two areas that I could offer you now of my experience that are quite clear, were quite close to each other in New Guinea. One was the Asmat area, where the Asmat people were very famous headhunters and cannibals, and they used to have two types of headhunting and cannibalism in their society. One which was where they would go out on raids, and they would then capture the heads of their enemies and bring them back, because they would need them for ritual, for things like weddings and births and that sort of stuff. And so they would need heads for that as forms of power and what have you. And another type would be, like you said, whereby a relative who passes has you've been incredibly close to, you might perhaps eat his brains. And people used to sleep on the skulls of use a skull as a pillow of relatives that they cared for very much. So even within that one group, you've got two very different types of, and you can see the skulls. Some of the skulls would be smashed in because they were the ones caught in warfare, and others would be intact because they were the relatives that they were they were like trying to connect with. So there's one group. But just down the river, there's another group who I spent time with, the Kombai we just talked about, the guy in the treehouse. That's why I said, like, naked gay cannibal in the treehouse. And so those three guys in the roof there, I mean, this is even in the film that we made, like, and I have no reason to doubt what they're saying. It's like, I genuinely had a wonderful experience with them. I don't think that they were savvy enough to have thought that this would be something that's just good for TV or something. It's like, I genuinely think that they were probably telling me the truth. And so the eldest one there, he said, like, he's killed 3 people, and he ate 2 of them, but the third one that he gave to his people from another village to eat because he was too close a relative for him to eat. But
not close enough to not kill him.
Well, so we get into incredibly complex areas here, trying to like discuss this, because you need such it's just like, genuinely the experience of being with these people was some of the loveliest people I've ever met. Now, we kill people in our culture. You go to North America and like people are being exterminated and electric chairs and all the rest of it. It's a form of whatever it is, judicial system and retribution or whatever. And in some ways, what seemed to be going on there was the only people in that particular group. Don't forget, the one I mentioned earlier would go out and get these heads for just any old ritual, and they were all out fighting. This was different. This was another group who were living in tree houses, and the only time they would ever kill and eat someone was if they felt that witchcraft was at play. And so the two things in that culture that people are most scared of is witchcraft or being accused of being a witch. Yeah. And because if I was on my deathbed and I said, oh, Jimmy did it, then my brothers might be duty bound to go and get Jimmy. So in its funny sort of way, looked through a different prism, that was, because it didn't happen very often, but it certainly kept people in line.
Yeah, just like the death penalty.
Well,
you can discuss if that keeps people in line, but...
Yeah, I mean, like, clearly neither are a perfect way. I mean, I'd much rather go and live with the Penan, who are, like, egalitarian, sweet, non-competitive, and also, interestingly, the most peaceful people on the planet. I didn't mention that earlier. We'll come to that in a second, but, like...
But they had wars with the Iban, right? And
no, so the Iban and the Dayaks who are all pretty aggressive, and they had headhunting too, but they're settled farmers. Okay. They came in a wave of migration like 20,000 years later than the Penan, who were there, and the Penan are known to be what they call conflict adverse. And most of these egalitarian groups, which is crazy, because all of this stuff, we've talked a lot about egalitarianism this evening. The one thing I forgot to mention is that Jerome said to me, oh, these are the most peaceful people on the planet. I'm like, Jerome, you can't make these like broads. I'm in television. This is going to be recorded. Like, you can't just make these broad statements. This is like crazy. And it's in the film. But the only reason I put it in the film is because he said, Bruce, you keep forgetting. It's like, I'm an anthropologist. I study at UCL. I don't make these statements lightly. You know, by every means by which anthropologists today measure things like that, people have been living with these groups now for decades, and time and again, the egalitarian, nomadic hunter-gatherer, sort of what they call instant return societies, are the most peaceful people on the planet by a huge factor. And these have been measured by every measure that we measure these things for decades now. I'm saying that because it's the reality, as far as we can say anything. So here we have like anarchical people with no leaders and no chiefs and no shamans that we would think, like, through the literature that we read, you know, like Lord of the Flies and all the rest of it, like we're all going to tear each other apart. Yeah. But here they are, and they're not. And not only are they not tearing each other apart, they're the most peaceful people on the planet. I mean, this shit is mad that we don't even know this. And there it is.
What could be the root cause of that? That they're less aggressive? Is it maybe because they don't?
Because then, well, look at every type of, and you know, so in the process of making this trip, I went and met a number of scientists who've studied equality and all this sort of stuff in our society. And you look at, there's a guy called Richard Wilkinson who I interviewed, who I found to be very interesting, and so he's done a number of papers on this, and you look at. He looks at like UN statistics, government statistics on all of the various things of all the nations around the world. And you look at things like diseases, and you look at antisocial behavior disorders, you look at prison sentences, you look at all the whole spectrum of stuff. And what he says the data clearly shows is that we think of things like poverty as being an indicator of poor health. He goes, it's not. It's like actually the biggest indicator in every instance of things like poor health and antisocial behavior disorders and all the rest of it is not being poor, it's feeling poor. That's it. It's how much disparity of wealth is there within that society? How are you feeling next to your neighbor who's got the Porsche, and you're the guy that go, I'm just as good as you, but society isn't allowing me to climb the ladder in the same way. Yeah. Fuck you. And the stress that we get from feeling that, and the stress that all of those things, that's the biggest indicator. And so it's no surprise to me that actually people who have an equality look at Scandinavian countries, and even this one to a degree.
No obsessions means no comparison stress, means less aggression.
All of that. It makes sense.
That's a good one. Feeling poor. Yeah. Yeah, there's no abundance in feeling poor.
Interesting.
Yeah.
One thing that might tap into this is that it doesn't matter where you are. If you're a human, you're going to encounter hardship. One of the greatest tools that I encountered in my life to deal with hardship is humor. Just look at it like a joke. It's a game. Just laugh it away. What is something that everybody on this planet, doesn't matter if you have an iPhone or you hunt with a bow and arrow, finds funny?
Farting.
Yeah, that was the fart jokes, probably. Yeah.
Why is that? Maybe that's just the English. No, I don't know. Not everyone finds farting funny. No, I mean some groups do, but no, it's not. So I don't know.
Somewhere it's highly offensive.
I don't know where that came from.
It's the first thing that popped to my mind as well.
Something wanting it to be the funny thing. Well, I've had that. You know, again, the other thing about, let's go back to the Penan. I would have answered that. Sometimes I'd have answered that question about humor is like when something happens that you weren't expecting to happen, especially when there's some chain of events where it's supposed to go this way and it goes another way, and especially if there's misfortune in that, then that seems to be what we would often find as funny. But I wonder if the Penan would find that funny. I think that might also underlie some aspect of ourselves that enjoys misfortune in others, or whatever it is, I don't know. And it was really interesting that this whole thing about no competition and stuff, like, so when I'm with them, even in the way they talk, which is why I'm getting at with the humor thing, because often humor is, you know, there's the verbal aspect to it. Not always, but often. But it's like so much of how I've enjoyed my life in, you know, growing up the way I do and being a Marine and like partying and all those sorts of things has been like the sort of what we would call banter, you know, it's like the wit, the chat, the like, but if I actually dissect a lot of that banter and wit, I see that there's an invisible hierarchy at play all the time in that. It's like, who can be a little bit funnier, who can actually put you down a little in the cleverest little way, but actually I'm having a little poke here and I'm having a little poke there. And then when I'm with the Penan, that was one of these other very subtle things that I found it very hard to put my finger on. I just don't believe that they're operating in that way.
Because they do tease, apparently.
The Penan.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely true.
So like the jibs and jabs. For example, we spoke about this as well, that there's this tendency where both martial artists, and in the locker room, there's always this, like, you're dissing each other just a little.
Yeah.
Not enough to be rude, but enough to feel, everybody's having a laugh at someone's expense. It's a play. But what you're actually saying is that might be a way to establish the
I think that it was just really interesting to see their way of interacting didn't seem to have so much of that. Having said that, you're right. There is a teasing, but often that teasing will be when someone's down. It's like a play. It's like a tickling them to bring them up again. So that's sort of a teasing. Yes, it's like, come on, stop being a mope.
Yeah,
bring it up. Yeah, basically, rather than that I'm more than you kind of teasing, which perhaps would be more the locker room.
Yeah.
There's a famous group called the Zoe who live in the Amazon who are famous for that. If anyone's down, they will tease them and tickle them. And they're called the tickling train. They tickle and come in and like literally, and they're all naked lying around on top of each other. They've all got multiple husbands and wives, and they're
I would imagine, yes.
Yeah, and they're very, very famous for like tickling people back into place. And likewise with the Benjeli, who are also egalitarian, as I said, the African tribe, they. The women are very much teasing the men, but they're generally teasing them to bring them down a bit, to make counter their behavior. So it's not ever about trying to raise yourself up. It's trying to maintain the balance.
Ego management, basically.
It's basically ego management, isn't it?
Yeah.
I remember I was with the cameraman when I was with the Penan this time. No, the soundman, amazing guy, he would run around and like throw the kids in the air, and they all loved it and were playing, and like it was like quite raucous, and the kids were running around and wanting more, as kids do, like being thrown in the air. And normally when I'm working with these on these films, it's just me that's interacting with the tribe, and that generally the crew are very much step back. But in this time making Tawai, the crew are much more involved, and it was interesting for me because I was like, I had to kind of find my own place within the crew and the tribe. And so when the friend of mine was like throwing the kids in the air and sort of being quite sort of boisterous with them, and the kids loving it, that I thought, maybe I need to do a bit of that. I'm feeling a little bit like I'm not interacting with the kids enough. So I started throwing the kids in the air. And it was so funny because I'd never I'd lived with that tribe before, and I'd never behaved like that. I just basically entered in as they are and sat around. And they're generally very placid. And so when I started throwing the kids in the air, I realized, oh my God, because I looked around and all of the adults were like staring at me. It's like almost like, what are you doing? And I realized that whatever it was inside of me, this sort of like little angst or this sort of like stuff, I was like transferring that into these kids and throwing them in the air. And the kids were like, yeah. But actually, they're never doing that. That's just something that we brought along. We're sort of transferring something in. But actually, amongst themselves, these kids, I remember looking at a kid who got stung by a hornet, and it's literally and people say his hand was as big as a balloon, but literally his hand was as big as a balloon. They had to cut off all his little bands around it. He just stared at it. He didn't cry. He's just looking at it. These kids are like super placid. You saw them dancing and swimming in the film. And I don't know, it's like when we think about things like competition and aggression, we think that it's so innate and it's so natural because we see it everywhere we look. Mm-hmm. But actually, I wonder when I was with that group, it's like, wow, the paradigm that we're swimming in has this there. And it's there from, kids say, well, Bruce, how can you tell us like this? My little Jimmy, he's like, from the first moment he's playing with guns, and well, where the guns come from?
It's like, saw it somewhere.
It's like the swords. It's like, we think these things are natural, and we explain them away and go, it's always been like that. But actually, when I compare it to the experience of being with this group, they're not doing that. Mm-hmm. I have to question so much. And it comes to some prominent voices in the world today who are saying, well, this is human nature, that all the studies say that this and all the studies say that, and there's a lot of confidence that people can have in the way that they express themselves, which upsets some people who feel intuitively that might not be the case, but the strength of voice that is brought to that with such confidence. And I'm like, you know what, mate? I don't know that all of the things that you're adding that confidence to would actually apply to every human being on the planet. Mm-hmm. I think that is, all of these studies have happened in the last 100 years. Mostly they've happened with male, like adult, like student age people in North America or whatever. These studies are not indications of human nature. They're indications of us. They're indications of schooling. They're indications of like 5,000 years of civilization. This is not indication of what I've experienced where I'm at. Yeah. You look at, there was a beautiful film recently, the Stanford Prison Experiment. 2 friends of mine were in it. It's an amazing film. But we all step away and go, okay, that is human nature. You split a group into 2, and some are prison and some are guards, prisoners and some are guards, and this is the behavior that they bring back. To me, that's like, no, that's just looking at school. That's just school you're seeing there.
However,
you're already sketching a situation with a hierarchy from people who did bad shit and people who are the good guys. So there's already a diversion in this whole experiment. So you're just waiting for it to grow. Yeah. But that's what happened.
If you look at, isn't it the exception that sort of confirms the rule? Because these egalitarian solutions, communities are way less prominent than the hierarchical.
Of course.
So there might be something to it that, well, it doesn't need to be like that. But if we look at the default mode, we go to that. But this could actually work as well. Isn't it more like that?
I think that absolutely. I'm not saying in any way that this is innate. I think that when people say there's competition inside us, he's right. But when someone says, look at the animal kingdom and they're competitive, therefore we are, it's like, look at what I learned with the Benjeli in Africa. Look at what those women saw. And there's all sorts of evolutionary things that are very different about human beings. When you actually pull back, why is it that the women wanted to go against the alpha male and bring in the other men to be in that space? What was their motivation, and how long might that have taken? What did we have to go through? So, I mean, there's all sorts of theories about this. Like, we stood upright, hips narrowed, we have to give birth early, those kids need a lot of attention and care. Very hard to do with just one guy. All he's doing is having sex with people and fighting off the men. It's like we need a bit more help. So what is different about us to the other apes that's kind of interesting? Well, if the women wanted to try and fight against that, there would be certain things that would have to happen in order for them to be able to say no. One of the things that's interesting is like we come into season in unison, in ostracis at the same time. We synchronize, which others don't do. And so we synchronize. Why? Because it's easier for us all to say no together than one person at a time, because otherwise you'll just be dragged to the side and raped.
Yep.
So by coming in unison, that's another thing that humans do that's kind of interesting. The other thing you don't show when you're in season. Lots of others to show the swellings and blood, all that. We don't. The fact that we like sex the whole year round, all these things, you look at it, it's like there's lots of really interesting things. And I'm not saying that this is for real. I'm not a woman, I can't say. But it's interesting that there's certain evolutionary things that have come about that have made us, that have allowed that to happen. So yes, we have come from this place of competition and hierarchy. And all of the other species are showing that to some degree. But that doesn't mean that we are that. And also it doesn't mean to say that left to their own devices, the men wouldn't get out of hand or even the women wouldn't get out of hand. But something has come about whereby that narrative was held. And that's why I'm fascinated by narrative. I mean, we've all read the book Sapiens. It's beautiful what he said. He talks about narrative. It's like, religion is a narrative, like money is a narrative, nationalism, these are narratives, but they are ways of all of us coming together under a common story, and huge societies can shift in a really rapid period of time. I mean, look at things like Christianity and Buddhism and stuff. For all of the wonderful aspects that they had, why was it that so many people flooded to those things? Well, quite possibly, and hey, none of us know the answer to this, and I'm not trying to say I have the answer. But what's interesting is that social constraints around at that time were liberated through these new philosophies. So, for example, Gentiles and Jews, suddenly there's an equality that comes about at that time. Likewise, with the caste system, the Buddhists didn't adhere to the caste system. No wonder teams of people rush towards it, as well as all the other great stuff. But it is quite interesting that these huge movements came about. Also, they allowed people to transcend the bonds that they might have been in at that time. That sort of story, if it gets a foothold, could do all sorts. And to know that we used to be equals and that we worked it and it worked for us, and that it could, it was something that we had tools to maintain for like 95% of our time on the planet. Yes, people would say to me, well, Bruce, we left the tropics. There was abundant resources, equal access to it. We could never do that again. We're not hunter-gatherers. We're not meditating every day. It's an impossible dream. And I'm like, no. Like, it's the story. We do have the ability to have abundant resources again. We have the technology. We have the ability to communicate with each other outside of the normal streams of power and influence. We have everything we need. There is all there if we just wanted it.
Yeah.
But we have to want it collectively. To want it collectively, we've got to know it. We've got to believe it. That's the challenge.
True. I think maybe that's something, well, I'm a techno-optimist. I would believe that something like Star Trek could be true, which is basically what you're describing. Resources for everyone, just focus on, not on war, but on progress and stuff like that. But I would probably say that we wouldn't be at this particular point technology-wise and civilization-wise if competition wasn't a thing.
I agree. And so... I totally agree. And I think that I'm also not wanting to turn back the clock. I'm not a technophobe either. It's like, I'm fully up for some of the blessings that have come about in this period of separation that we've been through. But like Ian McGilchrist talks about the brain, and the right and left hemisphere. And I like that as almost as a metaphor for what's happened today. It's like when the information comes streaming in, it stays in the right, and then that's when we experience the fullness and the majesty of everything. And in a way, perhaps that was our realm when we were in the forest, and that was our ability to connect and be in. But then in this latter period, we've gone more into the left, which sees things as separate, and that's where we can create these amazing tools and technologies and all the rest of it. And that's where we're kind of stuck. Like we're stuck in the left hemisphere where we see everything as separate. We see nature as a tool that can to be used and a resource for our own designs and all the rest of it. And the knowledge that we can control everything. So that's where we are. But actually the way the brain works best is for that information to then get put back into the wisdom of seeing everything in the whole. And more people waking up to this understanding that we're whole. The internet allows us to have this experience of being whole. And it makes so much sense to take that technology and place it in the utilization of the wisdom for everyone, in the knowledge that this way of being is actually, we're all happier, rich and poor. We're all happier when we're together. We remember the happiest times of our lives are generally when we're with our peers in nature having a good time. It's not when I bought the Mercedes and got promoted.
It was on my iPhone.
Yeah, it's like, so we're all on this conveyor belt being told these stories that this will bring you happiness and this will bring you happiness. Actually, they're taking us completely the wrong direction. The simpler things are just as good, but the reason we're wanting that is because we're told that Posh and Becks are happier than us because they got all that shit, and they're not. Yeah. They're just not.
No.
And
more money, more problems, basically.
Quite possibly. And having had the privilege of having a modicum of success in my own life of notoriety and material wealth and amazing lifestyle living in the Mediterranean and all these things, and rubbing shoulders with all sorts of very successful and well-off people. It's absolutely my belief that so many of these narratives that we're telling each other to bring us about happiness are pretty much going in completely the wrong direction. And so me moving to Wales to downsize and to give away my house into community space and have it co-owned and be connected to nature is not because it's like this last ditch attempt to try and find a solution to climate change. It's because I genuinely believe it will make me happier.
If you kind of makes me wonder if you talk about narratives and the way we look at ourselves and the story that we're following, and you take these tribes that are a part of the world, but at the same time not really, because they're sort of like isolated. How do they look at themselves in this bigger global narrative? Once they discovered, like, whoa, this is. Are they aware that they're on a planet? And there's something like a moon, and that there's Europe and America, and that there's all this stuff that they probably have no knowledge about.
Again, it's like obviously so many groups, everyone with a different answer to that. I've come across very many degrees of that in my journeys. And there are still tribal groups on the planet that we consider to be uncontacted, but even they are aware of much. They might not be aware of cities, but they've all had interactions with the other tribes. Yeah. And it's quite possible as well that some of those groups, especially in places like the Amazon, are the refugees from like the rubber times and stuff. And so we don't know much about them, but there's quite possible that even they have their own understanding to some degree. But what level of understanding that is will differ. one of the things that people often used to say when I did my tribe programs is, Bruce, what are you doing going to these places? Surely you're changing these people by bringing in this sort of cameras in the outside world, and you're affecting them and stuff. And I understand that, and it's right and proper that people feel that sort of sense of loss of romance, and I get that. But actually, what the reality is, in my experience, is that actually even the most distant-looking, remote indigenous group that you're seeing on television and thinking they're just in complete isolation, of course they're not. They've nearly all been to the city. Every single member of that tribe they're in the cash economy to some degree. They might not have much money, but they know what it is. They can sell something and buy something. They have all been to town. Most have been to the city. I live with a group in the middle of the Amazon who was only contacted like 30 years ago. And every single member of that community has been to Rio. They're all living in this incredibly interesting way that relates to their old ways, but they've all watched television.
I have to admit, that's a bit of a disillusion.
Yeah, but it's the reality, because the world is so much smaller. And also the other thing is, like, the real pressures on those people isn't me coming in with a film crew. Yes, I am. I'm not trying to escape the fact that I'm affecting them. Of course I am. I acknowledge that, and I try my hardest to make that as positive an exchange as possible. But the real forces at play are the missionaries, the miners, the loggers, the military. Ultimately, we're affecting them by what we buy, much more than by people going to visit them in a holistic way. That's the pressure, is the economic globalized system that is, we don't care where the shit is that we buy it from. And you can be the most well-meaning vegan here and still causing destruction on the other side of the planet because you're not aware of where that stuff is coming from. It's like there's a very complex space that we're living in, and it's really hard to figure out how best to be.
I wonder if these... did you heard about this? The guy that went to these islands in India, missionary.
Yeah.
And they turned him into a pincushion.
Yeah.
But
that's... I could have told him before he went that would happen.
You know about this tribe?
Yeah.
They're xenophobistic, right?
North Sentinelese. I only read about it literally 10 minutes ago, this story, but so I don't know the whole details because I didn't read it all, but I know the North Sentinelese. People have been trying to contact them for many, many years. People literally take pigs and put them, like, tie them to a stake as a peace offering on the edge of the beach, and then go away. And then they come back like a week or a day later, and the pig's just full of arrows. It's like, we don't want it.
Yeah,
off you go.
They refuse everything.
And you can imagine that they probably had horrendous past experience, and that's their narrative now. Don't let them in, because if you do, genocide end, and they're probably the wisest people on the planet, frankly.
Because they're probably not wrong.
Well, because the sad truth is that nearly every single indigenous group that has been contacted in the last 100 years or 500 years have gone through absolutely the hardest times, mostly with disease, and then through all sorts of cultural just complexities and loss of identity, and no one's really supporting them. We're not really ready yet to bring them into our world in a way that doesn't really upset them. I think
they're a special case, though. I think even in French Polynesia last year, another tourist got killed as well.
Really?
But it's delicate, man.
Yeah,
I can imagine. Yeah.
And it's only 50, I think they don't even know how many people are. Maybe they estimate between 15 and 50 people, some rumors.
Sure.
That's not a lot. That's a family.
You know? And I obviously, what I just said there, I'm sort of reeling with it a little bit because I don't know enough of this story, and obviously it's very tragic that someone's passed, and I don't know the whole narrative. So, obviously compassion in that space too, and
at the same time, you have to wonder. He wasn't the first guy to try to go in.
No, it was the second time he actually visited already. Because the first time he visited, he got shot, and he actually got shot. He got an arrow in his Bible. Now, if you're talking about omens.
Oh, he thought that was a hint.
With all respect, he went back again. And I think fishermen just dropped him off on the beach. And that's kind of further.
He had his own agenda, and he was something that he wanted to do, and they are clearly pushing him back.
I think that the family was also very forgiving about the fact that he went there for the second time, without permission, and they actually forgave the people who killed a relative.
Is that me? Sorry, mate.
Yeah, that was you. That's okay.
Still working.
Yeah,
we've had worse. Way worse.
That's my bulletproof coffee over my MacBook and my phone dropping, people. That's okay. We're cool.
Now we're officially a podcast.
That was me.
Yeah,
I do apologize. Is that the end?
No, definitely not, man. No.
You have to leave right now.
Am I going to make my flight?
No, you're my favorite guest anyway, so you won't
I'm
be
loving
hurt.
this.
You won't be hurt.
A thing I was wondering about, since you've seen, I think everybody.
We do have to watch the time, bro, because we're really on a few minutes, and then everything starts beeping and going off. So we got 5 minutes left on the clock.
Cool.
5 minutes left on the clock.
Yeah,
well,
so
no,
go ahead.
No.
You get one question, I get one question, then we're done.
All right. If you look at the tribes in every biosphere that you've been in, you've been to the Arctic, you've been to the Amazon, you've been to Africa. What have you seen in the way that they organize themselves depending on the climate that they're in? Is there a pattern you can see, like, well, if they're in the jungle, they're most likely to do this. And if they're in the Arctic, they're most likely to choose this path?
Not really. I mean, like, clearly things like, the further to the extremes you go, you can't grow stuff. So you can't be a vegan in the Arctic. You got to eat meat. In fact, you're probably only going to eat meat. So those sorts of things. But that's not about societal structure. And so, no, I mean, you can exist in both ways. There were nomadic hunter-gatherers, the Inuit people living in the Arctic, but there are also farming or, let's say, domesticated people like the reindeer herders. So that's a domestication of an animal. So that's the sort of thing that would come about after the Neolithic Revolution. So that way of being is a much more modern way of being, where they're going in and they're taking the deer and they're transporting themselves around with the deer. So actually both ways of being are possible in that environment. And so really, I think that everything is possible everywhere. And like humans were able to, to migrate out into the world in all sorts of different ways.
I was thinking along the lines of the way they sort of structure their communities, because we talked about different forms of relationships. And someone once explained to me that, for example, the Inuit have a system where it's several guys to one girl because of, the lack of resources. And it's the best strategy to get offspring grown up if two guys are trying to provide for one.
Absolutely. I mean, definitely the environments around the world, I think I said it earlier as well, I think the environment is primary in the way that we have figured out how to be in relationship. And so, I was with polyandrous people in the yak herders in the Himalayas, because they wanted one guy had to go to deal with the yaks and the other guy did the garden. So they would generally have brothers with the same wife. And so that would be one methodology. And you go to another place and, like that Zoe tribe I was telling you about earlier, who are much more sort of polyamorous, let's say. And so a man might have multiple wives. And then I remember a friend of mine who was there who was saying, he was talking to a woman and she was just lying in a hammock. She goes, well, here's my 3 husbands. This one's the best fisherman. This one's the best hunter, and this one's the best lover. And so basically, everything's out there. And so many people have said to me, what's our natural way of coming into relationship with each other? And I think just like what we talked about earlier about competition and hierarchy, and I don't think there's a natural way. I think that we have evolved in certain ways to allow some things to be easier. But we still have to work at them. It's not like we fall into that naturally. And I think likewise with monogamy or polyamory, for example, none of them are a perfect fit. Most of these egalitarian groups tend to be monogamous, interestingly. They tend to be...
I did not expect that.
Serial monogamists. Yeah, and I think that if you think about... I mean, I've sat with that for so long. Like, why would that be? Because like polyamory seems so much more natural, like we all want. But actually... we probably don't have time to get into it, but like when I've really sat with it, I've like actually I can get why it is that they're like that. They're not rigid, so they're what they call serial monogamists. So they can easily split up and find a new partner, but they tend to be everyone's served within the community. Everyone has a partner. It's not like just the best looking, or it's like, so everyone again is catered for, everyone is looked after in that sense, and that's part of it. And I don't think there's any superior voice saying that. They've just figured that out for themselves. Whereas there's other groups who do it incredibly differently. And I think that as we left that tropical belt, as we went into different environments, just like in the Arctic, just like in the Himalayas, these other ways of being in relationship with each other have come about. But for me, the thing that was most important was, why are we having so many problems in our society? And there seem to be not less, but the different types of problems there. It's like, for me, what I realized was the most important thing wasn't what you did, but that everyone understood the rules, that we all buy into that plan.
They're all playing the same game.
Yeah, well, so basically, as the pain comes when you don't know. You know, like I could be a polyamorous guy who's totally happy to have multiple partners, and then make love to a girl who thinks she's going to start a relationship with me, and then but actually I've come to meet her with a completely different value system. We haven't discussed it beforehand. That's when the pain's going to arrive. But if actually we all know that this is the strategy, and we're all in the same game together, then we know the rules before we start, and there's much less.
I get it.
Sort of discord. And so that to me was that was the interesting thing. It's like we're all living in these different environments. There are going to be different strategies. The most important thing is we all understand the strategy.
Yeah. Plus it kind of makes sense if you look at the fact that it's sort of like enforced monogamy. Not that everybody has to have a partner or you get forced to a partner, but everybody's like, well, you can't have more than one girl because that's inequality. And then you might get conflict within the group because there's one guy is left out, and then there's the jock who has like, Chad has like 4 girlfriends.
I think that there might be something in that. I mean, it's a very subtle thing because, again, no one's saying it, no one's forcing. These are like non-coercive groups. But maybe if one imagines oneself in this realm where your consciousness is less about yourself and it's more about the group. It's more about understanding that actually everything's going to be better if we as a group are harmonious, not only with each other, but also with nature. And so empathy is a huge part of that. It's like your pain is my pain, your pleasure is my pleasure. So if I'm imagining that the well-being of the forest is also the well-being of our society, and it's a felt thing. It's not a conceptual thing, it's a felt thing. So on your daily basis, you are experiencing a way of being where you're feeling that actually everything is better off if we're keeping the balance. Somehow, if that can be your daily bread, if you can meditate into that space, it probably makes sense that everyone is served and sexually and their needs met sexually too.
Yeah.
And if that is probably maybe best set out, that we all find someone to be with.
Yeah. Do unto others as you would unto yourself, basically. Right?
Except that it's a felt thing. It would be... That feels like a rule, an order, yeah. And I would say that I'm so sorry. I would say that it's much more of a feeling of care, a feeling of empathy, and that no one has to tell me that. It's like, you know, I feel pain if you're in pain. That's so I'm going to do what I can to try and minimize that. That's how I'm sort of trying to figure this out. I think it's a felt thing.
All right. So, interesting. Thank you.
To finish off the podcast, first of all, thanks for being here and having the time.
It's been great.
You have to come back for your when the Hawaii is going live. Cool.
This was one of the fastest going podcasts.
Is this the warm-up?
Probably the longest one.
Yeah, but really short on time. So
it's the longest one. How long have we done?
2 hours, 45 minutes.
I'm gonna have a short on video and audio. So I'm gonna ask this question as the finisher, and after this we just end it.
Yeah.
So what is the most astonishing or most insightful comment that you ever comment or insight that you ever got from an elder or a tribe leader or anyone who you met on your indigenous journeys?
I'm so terrible at these like most best favorite sort of questions.
What's the first one that pops to mind? It's usually the best.
I go blank. Oh, this is going to be a terrible way to finish our chat. We've had such a flow.
All right.
I really can't. You know, I'm swarming with. I can't. Nothing comes up.
How about it's a nice one to finish off. The one which the Mahari tribe in the Amazon.
Oh, the Matisse?
No, the story that you told yesterday on stage, where you actually went translating with the missionaries.
Okay, yeah. So that's the.
So if you can tell it in 2 or 3 minutes, then we're good.
So this group are really interesting. I heard about them through this guy Daniel Everett, who wrote this book. and he described how this group had no future or past tense, and that they were very present, and that they were experiencing a connection to something greater than themselves, that was a voice that they heard that guided them. And so I went there to go and meet these people because I was very interested in how it was that they were receiving this information. And this guy told me that he received it through his heart, and then it became information in his mind. And I found that really interesting. But the journey of translating that was very, very difficult, because there's only a few people who speak the language. And Daniel was very busy, and he offered to help, but it was like it took a long time, for so much so that actually I couldn't use him. So I went to meet his wife, who's still out there, and then she was translating these things. And of course, this is a very sensitive thing for missionaries to be telling us about, because I'm asking about spirit, and so that became an incredibly long and complex journey of trying to get the translations. And in the end I did, and I'm really happy with them, because I think that what we received made a lot of sense. And some of the things, the testimonies that I got from that wonderful group of people were relatively self-deprecating to themselves, and then every one of the translators along the way was also there was no reason why they would have given me that information, because it didn't serve them or anyone. It was like quite complex what we were receiving, and so I was left with it going, wow, that feels like a real truism. And well, you have to see the film, but these people who are guided through the forest are suddenly now going against their guidance and doing things that are causing great pain in nature. And they're describing that, and it's so painful. And I wondered to myself, wow, is that a wound that we're all carrying? Is that something deep inside of us that we've all got, this seed of we know at the deepest aspect of our intuitive selves that we're going against the greatest wisdom of nature itself? And that is one of the reasons we can't go there and look.
That's beautiful.
I think that's true. And I think that's a great way to end this one.
Yeah. Thank you for being
here. All right.
Man.
Thanks, man.
Hey, guys. Really enjoyed it.
It was great.
Yeah. We went around the houses.
We did. We went
guys.
the long road. All right.
To the next one.
To the next one. Listeners, ciao.